Hello friends. Did you know nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy these stories, please hit that subscribe button and leave a like. It really helps. Thank you for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. Truman Vale's Peterbilt rolled past mile 183 at exactly 12:47 a.m. The dashboard clock glowing pale green in the darkness of the cab. According to his manifest, El Paso was still 6 hours out, but that calculation assumed straight highway driving. Out here in the mountain pass between Arizona and New Mexico, where the two-lane road coiled through rock formations and dropped into sudden valleys, the real time always stretched longer. Through the windshield, Truman could see nothing beyond the twin cones of his headlights cutting through the black. No moon, no stars, no taillights from another vehicle. Just his truck's high beams sweeping across the empty asphalt, catching the occasional creosote bush or twisted juniper clinging to the roadside. He'd been running this route for 3 years now, ever since his dispatcher learned he didn't mind the isolation. Most drivers preferred the interstate 30 miles south, where rest stops appeared every 50 miles and the CB chatter kept you company. But Truman's cargo was sensitive. Precision electronics that couldn't handle the constant vibration of heavy truck traffic. And this old highway offered smoother pavement, gentler curves, and almost no one else. The CB radio mounted below his instrument panel hummed with static on channel 19, the universal trucker frequency. At this hour, though, no one was talking. Occasionally, a burst of interference would crackle through, or a fragment of conversation from some distant relay tower would bloom and fade before he could make out the words. Truman's right hand rested loosely on the steering wheel while his left brought a thermos cup to his lips. The coffee had gone lukewarm, bitter at the edges, but it was enough to keep his eyelids from drooping. Mile markers passed in rhythmic intervals. Mile 185, mile 187, mile 189. Each one flaring green in his headlights for a split second before vanishing back into the endless dark. He'd planned to take a break around 1 o'clock. His GPS showed a way station somewhere near mile 205, though he wasn't sure if it was still operational. Either way, 10 minutes to stretch his legs and check his fuel gauge would be enough to keep him sharp for the final push into Texas. At 1:03 a.m., as he passed the mile 191 marker, a small sign appeared on the right shoulder. Truman almost didn't notice it at first. Desert highways were littered with forgotten markers, faded detour warnings from roadwork completed years ago, rusted reflectors that hadn't been maintained since the 80s. But as his truck closed the distance, he eased off the accelerator and let his speed drop. The sign was smaller than standard highway markers, its reflective strips dulled by dust and weather, but the text was still legible in his headlights. Service Road, 0.3 miles. An arrow pointed east into the darkness beyond the shoulder. Truman frowned. He'd driven this stretch dozens of times and had never seen that sign before. More to the point, his GPS showed nothing out here. No rest area, no way station, no services of any kind for another 14 miles. He glanced at the odometer, then back at the road. The turnoff appeared exactly where the sign had promised. A narrow strip of asphalt branching off to the right, unmarked except for a single faded yellow line running down its center. No lights, no indication of what lay at the end. For a few seconds, Truman considered driving past. His schedule was tight, and exploring unmarked roads in the middle of nowhere wasn't part of the plan. But his lower back was starting to ache from hours in the seat, and his fuel gauge had dropped lower than he'd like. If this service road led to an old truck stop or even just a wide turnaround, it might be worth the detour. He flipped on his turn signal, a habit even when no one else was around, and guided the Peterbilt onto the narrow road. The asphalt here was older, cracked in places, with weeds pushing through the edges. His headlights swept across low hills of scrub brush and scattered boulders. The road curved gently to the left, then straightened out, climbing a shallow grade. Truman kept his speed under 20, listening to the hum of his tires on the rough pavement, the faint rattle of his cargo in the trailer behind him. The CB radio crackled once, a burst of static that sounded almost like a voice, but it faded before he could make out any words. After about half a mile, the road leveled out and opened into a wide clearing. Truman's headlights illuminated a structure ahead, a long, low building with a flat roof and concrete walls, painted a faded tan that had bleached almost white under years of desert sun. It looked like an old way station, the kind that used to be scattered along secondary highways before budget cuts and automation made them obsolete. The building had a large roll-up door on one side, closed and locked, and a smaller entrance near the front with a rusted metal frame. A single light pole stood in the parking area, but the bulb was either burned out or never connected. The only illumination came from Truman's truck. He pulled into the lot and set the parking brake, leaving the engine idling. For a moment he just sat there, hands still on the wheel, studying the building. Something about it felt off. Not dangerous exactly, but wrong in a way he couldn't quite name. The windows were dark, covered from the inside with what looked like sheets of plywood or cardboard. No signs, no posted hours, no indication that this place had been used for anything in a long time. And yet the pavement, though cracked, wasn't overgrown. The building's walls, though faded, weren't collapsed or vandalized. It looked abandoned, but not forgotten. Truman reached for his flashlight in the door pocket and stepped down from the cab. The desert air was cooler than he'd expected, carrying the faint smell of sage and dust. His boots crunched on gravel as he walked toward the building's entrance. The metal door was ajar, hanging slightly crooked on its hinges. He pushed it open with the back of his hand, not wanting to touch the handle directly, and stepped inside. The interior was darker than the night outside. His flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing a large open space that had once been a waiting area. A few plastic chairs were stacked in one corner, their seats cracked and sun-bleached. A counter ran along the far wall, its surface covered in a layer of fine dust. Behind the counter, a corkboard still held a few yellowed papers, notices about truck weight limits, a decades-old map of the county road system, a safety poster with colors so faded the text was barely readable. Truman moved the flashlight slowly across the room, taking in the details. Everything suggested this place had been closed for years, maybe a decade or more. But something was nagging at him, a detail his brain had registered but hadn't yet processed. He walked over to the counter and looked more closely at the papers pinned to the corkboard. Most were exactly what you'd expect. Administrative notices, inspection schedules, a phone list with numbers that probably didn't work anymore. But one document caught his eye. It was a logbook page, the kind truck drivers used to fill out by hand before electronic logging devices became mandatory. The paper was crisp, not yellowed like the others, and the ink looked fresh. Truman leaned in closer, angling his flashlight to read the handwritten entries. The first thing he noticed was the date at the top of the page. November 3rd, 2025. Today's date. His pulse quickened slightly, a small jolt of adrenaline that made his fingers tighten around the flashlight. He scanned down the columns. Driver name, truck number, cargo, time in, time out. There were only 3 entries, all in the same neat handwriting. The first 2 names meant nothing to him, J. Corbin, D. Salazar. But the third entry made his breath catch in his throat. Truman stared at the page, his mind racing through explanations. A coincidence. There had to be other drivers with the initials T, except his truck was a Peterbilt 579 and his unit number was 447. He glanced at his watch, 1:11 a.m. 2 minutes past the time written on the log. His hand was steady, but his heartbeat wasn't. He told himself this was some kind of prank. Maybe another driver with the same rig who'd stopped here earlier and decided to mess with whoever came next. But that didn't explain how they'd know he'd be here, on this road, at this exact time. He reached for the CB mic clipped to his belt, thumbing it on. Any units on Channel 19? This is Truman Vale near mile 191 on Old Route 9. Anybody out there familiar with the service road way station? His voice sounded too loud in the empty building, bouncing off the concrete walls. The CB crackled with static, then fell silent. He tried again, this time on Channel 17, a less common frequency some local drivers used. This is Truman Vale, Peterbilt 447, requesting any info on the old way station east of mile 191. Anybody copy? For several seconds there was nothing but the hiss of dead air. Then a voice broke through, male, low, distorted by static or distance. The words were clipped, hard to make out. Don't use, service road, turn back. The transmission cut off abruptly, replaced by silence. Truman pressed the mic again. Say again, I didn't copy. What about the service road? No response. He waited another 30 seconds listening to the faint buzz of the CB, but the voice didn't return. He clipped the mic back onto his belt and looked around the room again. His instincts were screaming at him to leave, to get back in his truck and return to the main highway. But another part of him, the part that had kept him alive on the road for 20 years, wanted answers. If this was some kind of setup, he needed to know. If it was just a creepy coincidence, he needed to confirm it and move on. He walked back toward the entrance, then paused. On the wall beside the door, half hidden behind a stack of old traffic cones, was another corkboard. This one was smaller, and the papers pinned to it looked newer. Truman moved the cones aside and aimed his flashlight at the board. The documents were police reports, or at least photocopies of them. The first one was dated August 2019 and detailed a missing person case, a truck driver named Marcus Holt, who'd disappeared on Route 9 near mile 195. The second report, from April 2021, described another disappearance. A driver named Elena Soto, last seen at a fuel stop in Deeming, her truck found abandoned near mile 188. There were 5 more reports, all following the same pattern. Drivers who'd vanished on this stretch of highway, their rigs sometimes found, sometimes not, but the drivers themselves never located. Truman's mouth went dry. He scanned the names again, looking for any he recognized. None of them rang a bell, but the pattern was undeniable. 7 drivers, all gone without a trace, all within a 10-mile stretch of this road. And now his name was written in a logbook dated for today, with no time of departure. A sound from outside made him spin around. A soft, metallic click, like a door latch being tested. Truman killed his flashlight and moved to the window, peering through a gap in the plywood. His truck was still idling in the lot exactly where he'd left it. But now there was another vehicle beside it. A dark-colored pickup with no plates, its headlights off. He hadn't heard it approach. 2 figures stood near the passenger side of his Peterbilt, one of them reaching for the door handle. Truman's training kicked in. He wasn't a fighter, but he knew how to move fast when he needed to. He slipped out the back exit of the building, a door he'd noticed earlier that led to a loading area behind the way station. The night air hit him again, colder now, and he moved quickly but quietly along the side of the building, keeping to the shadows. From this angle, he could see the 2 figures more clearly. Both wore dark jackets and baseball caps pulled low. One of them was trying the driver's door of his truck, while the other stood watch, scanning the area with a handheld flashlight. Truman reached into his pocket and pulled out his keys. The panic button on his key fob would trigger the truck's alarm and horn, loud enough to wake the dead, and more importantly, loud enough to scare off anyone who didn't want attention. He pressed it once, hard. The Peterbilt's horn blasted across the clearing, a long, piercing wail that echoed off the hills. The two figures jerked back from the truck, momentarily frozen. Truman didn't wait to see what they'd do next. He sprinted toward the cab, keys in hand, and yanked open the driver's door. The figure who'd been trying the handle had already retreated to the pickup, and the engine roared to life. Truman threw himself into the seat, slammed the door, and released the parking brake in one motion. His foot hit the accelerator as the pickup's headlights snapped on, blinding him for a split second. The Peterbilt lurched forward, tires spinning on loose gravel before finding traction. Truman didn't bother with a three-point turn. He just aimed for the service road and floored it, the trailer swaying behind him as he picked up speed. In the rearview mirror, the pickup was following, but it wasn't gaining. Truman knew his rig couldn't outrun a light vehicle on straightaways, but he also knew these roads. If he could make it back to the highway, he'd have options. He kept the accelerator down, watching the narrow road unspool in his headlights, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The turnoff to the main highway appeared faster than he'd expected, and he took the corner wide, feeling the trailer's rear wheels drift slightly before the weight settled. The pickup followed, its headlights filling his mirrors with harsh white light. But as soon as Truman merged onto the two-lane highway, the pickup fell back. He watched it slow, then stop at the edge of the service road, as if there were an invisible line it wouldn't cross. After a few seconds, it reversed, headlights sweeping across the desert, and disappeared back down the service road. Truman didn't slow down. He kept his speed at 70, 10 miles over the posted limit, and didn't touch the brakes until he saw the glow of a truck stop on the horizon 20 minutes later. When he finally pulled into the lot and killed the engine, his hands were shaking. He sat there for a long time, staring at the bright fluorescent lights of the building, listening to the tick of the cooling engine. Other trucks were parked in neat rows around him, their drivers asleep or inside getting coffee. Normal, safe, real. He thought about the logbook with his name on it, the police reports on the wall, the voice on the CB warning him to turn back, and the two figures who'd tried to get into his truck, who'd chased him back to the highway but stopped at the boundary as if they knew better than to follow. Truman pulled out his phone and opened the browser, searching for news about missing truck drivers on Route 9. The results came back sparse. A few old articles, nothing recent. But buried in a local forum, he found a thread from 3 years ago. Anyone else creeped out by the old way station near mile 191? The replies were a mix of skepticism and unease. One driver claimed to have stopped there and found his own name in a logbook before he'd even signed in. Another said the place was a front for cargo theft, that smugglers used it to intercept trucks carrying high-value loads. A third insisted it was just an abandoned building, and people were reading too much into it. Truman closed the browser and stared at his phone's dark screen. He didn't know what he'd stumbled into, but he knew he wasn't going back to find out. Tomorrow, he'd call his dispatcher and tell them to route him on the interstate from now on, even if it added an hour to his drive time. Some shortcuts weren't worth taking. He grabbed his duffel from the sleeper and headed inside for coffee and a shower. As he walked across the lot, he glanced back at his truck one more time. In the harsh overhead lights, it looked solid and ordinary. Just a working rig like 100 others parked here tonight. But he couldn't shake the image of that logbook page, his name written in fresh ink. The time matching almost exactly when he'd pulled into that clearing. He thought about the driver who'd written it, if it even was another driver, and wondered if they'd known what was waiting, or if they'd been just as surprised as he was. Inside the truck stop, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and a country song played from a speaker near the register. A few drivers sat at the counter, nursing coffee and picking at plates of eggs and toast. Everything was warm and familiar and safe. Truman ordered his own coffee, and took a seat by the window where he could see his truck. He'd stay here until sunrise, he decided. No more night driving on back roads, no more taking chances with routes he didn't know. But even as he told himself that, he knew the questions would stay with him. Who were those men in the pickup? How did his information end up in a logbook at an abandoned way station? And what happened to the other drivers whose names were on those police reports? The ones who'd disappeared without a trace on the same stretch of highway he'd just escaped. He didn't have answers. He wasn't sure he wanted them. All he knew was that somewhere out there, on a dark service road branching off mile 191, something was waiting. And he'd come closer to it than he ever wanted to again. Truman didn't sleep that night. He sat in the truck stop booth until the sky started to pale, watching his Peterbilt through the window like it might disappear if he looked away. The coffee had gone cold in his cup an hour ago, but he kept holding it anyway, needing something solid in his hands. Around 5:30, the morning shift workers started arriving. A waitress who looked half asleep, a cook who moved through the kitchen with mechanical efficiency, a fuel attendant who nodded at Truman as he passed. Normal people doing normal jobs, unaware that 20 miles down the road, something deeply wrong was happening in an abandoned way station. By 6 a.m., Truman had made his decision. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number for the Highway Patrol District office. He'd dealt with them before over the years. A few traffic stops, one accident report when he'd blown a tire on I-10, routine way station checks. He didn't know anyone personally, but he knew they took trucker reports seriously, especially when it involved potential cargo theft or highway safety issues. The line rang 4 times before a dispatcher answered, her voice crisp and professional. Truman explained what had happened, keeping his tone level and factual. The abandoned way station, the logbook with his information, the 2 men in the pickup, the police reports about missing drivers. The dispatcher listened without interrupting, then asked him to hold. 2 minutes passed, then 3. Muzak played softly in the background, some instrumental version of a song Truman didn't recognize. When the line clicked back, a different voice came on, male, deeper, with the flat authority of someone used to being obeyed. "This is Trooper Deacon Rusk. You're reporting an incident near mile 191 on Old Route 9. Truman confirmed and repeated his story, adding more details this time. Rusk asked him where he was now, what his truck looked like, whether he'd been injured. All standard questions, but Truman detected something else in the trooper's tone. Not quite surprise, but a kind of weary recognition, like he'd heard similar stories before. "Stay where you are," Rusk said finally. "I'm about 40 minutes out. Don't go back to that location, and don't talk to anyone else about this until we've had a chance to discuss it in person." The line went dead before Truman could ask why. He set the phone down and stared at it for a moment, processing the trooper's words. Don't talk to anyone else. That wasn't standard procedure for a simple trespassing or attempted theft report. That sounded like something bigger, something Rusk didn't want getting out before he had the control of the narrative. Truman walked back to his truck and did a full inspection, something he should have done hours ago but had been too shaken to attempt. He circled the Peterbilt slowly, checking the trailer doors, the straps securing his cargo, the tires and undercarriage. Everything looked normal. No scratches, no tampering, no signs that the 2 men had managed to get inside before he'd scared them off. But when he reached the passenger side, he noticed something he'd missed in the dark. On the bottom step, just below the door handle, was a smear of reddish-brown dust. It looked like clay or dried mud, but the texture was wrong. Too fine, almost powdery. Truman crouched down and touched it with one finger. The residue came away easily, staining his skin in a way that felt uncomfortably like old blood, though he knew it wasn't. It was just desert soil, the kind that turned to powder after months without rain. Still, it bothered him. He hadn't walked through any dirt patches last night, and his route from the way station to his truck had been on pavement the whole way, which meant someone else had left that mark, someone who'd climbed up to his door and left traces of where they'd been. Truman pulled out his phone and took a photo of the smudge, then wiped it clean with a rag from his toolbox. He wasn't sure why he felt the need to document it, but instinct told him every detail mattered now. 45 minutes later, a white Ford Explorer with highway patrol markings pulled into the truck stop lot. The vehicle parked 2 spaces down from Truman's rig, and a man in his late 40s stepped out, tall, broad-shouldered, with gray threading through his dark hair, and the kind of face that had spent too many years squinting into the sun. He wore the standard tan uniform with a badge on his chest and a sidearm on his hip. But what struck Truman most was the way he moved. Deliberate, cautious, like someone walking into a situation that might turn bad without warning. Trooper Deacon Rusk looked around the parking lot once before approaching, his eyes cataloging every vehicle, every person, every possible line of sight. "Mr. Vale," Rusk extended his hand, and Truman shook it. The trooper's grip was firm, but not aggressive, professional. "Appreciate you waiting. Let's talk in your cab if that's all right with you. More privacy." Truman nodded and led the way. They climbed into the Peterbilt, Rusk taking the passenger seat and pulling the door shut behind him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Rusk studied the interior of the cab, the logbook on the dash, the CB radio, the thermos still sitting in the cup holder. Then he pulled out a small notebook and a pen. "Tell me again what happened last night. Start from when you first saw the sign for the service road." Truman went through it all again, slower this time, pausing when Rusk asked for clarification or made notes. The trooper's face remained neutral throughout, giving nothing away. But when Truman described the logbook with his name and truck number already written in it, Rusk's pen stopped moving. "You're certain it was your information? Not just similar?" Truman nodded. "Unit 447, Peterbilt 579. My initials. The time was 2 minutes before I looked at my watch. I didn't imagine it." Rusk tapped his pen against the notebook, thinking. "And the police reports on the wall. You remember any of the names?" Truman recited the 2 he'd memorized. Marcus Holt from 2019, Elena Soto from 2021. Rusk's expression didn't change, but his jaw tightened slightly. Those are real cases. Both still open. Holt's truck was found abandoned near mile 188. No sign of him. Soto's rig disappeared completely, like she drove off the edge of the earth. He paused, choosing his words carefully. There have been others. Not just drivers. Hikers, motorists, people passing through this area who never made it to their destination. 7 confirmed disappearances over the last 6 years, all within a 10-mile radius of where you stopped last night. The confirmation sent a chill through Truman's chest. "So, what is that place? Some kind of trap?" Rusk exhaled slowly, rubbing his temple like he was fighting off a headache. "Officially, it's an abandoned way station that was decommissioned in 2003. The county owns the land but doesn't maintain it. We've responded to calls out there before. Vagrants using it for shelter, kids breaking into party, that sort of thing. But every time we investigate, there's nothing. No evidence of recent activity, no signs of foul play, just an empty building." He met Truman's eyes. "Unofficially, there are rumors. Smuggling networks using old government infrastructure to move contraband. cargo thieves posing as law enforcement to intercept high-value shipments. Even some talk about a rogue operation, former cops or military running illegal checkpoints to rob drivers, but we've never found proof. No witnesses who'd talk, no physical evidence we could use in court. Truman felt his frustration rising. What about the logbook? What about those two men who tried to break into my truck? Rusk held up a hand. I believe you. But here's the problem. If we go out there right now, what do you think we'll find? I'm willing to bet that logbook page is gone. Those police reports you saw, probably gone too. And the men in the pickup, they'll be long gone. And without a license plate or clear description, we've got nothing to go on. These people, whoever they are, they're careful. They cover their tracks. So what am I supposed to do? Just forget it happened? Truman's voice came out harder than he'd intended, but he didn't care. He'd nearly been ambushed last night, and now he was being told there was no way to follow up. Rusk leaned back in the passenger seat, his expression softening slightly. No, you did the right thing by calling it in. I'm going to file a report, and I'll send a unit out to that way station today to document whatever's there. But I'm also going to give you some advice, driver to driver. Don't go back to Route 9. Use the interstate from now on. I know it's longer, and I know your cargo might be sensitive, but it's not worth the risk. Whatever's happening out there, it's been going on for years, and we haven't been able to stop it. Until we do, the best thing you can do is stay away. Truman wanted to argue, but he knew Rusk was right. He wasn't a cop or a detective. He was a truck driver with a load to deliver and a schedule to keep. Getting involved in whatever criminal operation was using that way station as a base wasn't his job. Still, the thought of just walking away sat poorly with him. What about the other drivers? The ones who disappeared? Do their families know you're still investigating? Rusk's silence was answer enough. After a moment, he said quietly, "Some cases go cold. Doesn't mean we stop caring. It just means we run out of leads." They sat in the cab for another few minutes while Rusk finished his notes and collected Truman's contact information. Before he left, the trooper reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card. "If you remember anything else, or if anyone contacts you about last night, call me directly. My cell's on the back." Truman took the card and studied it. Deacon Rusk, Highway Patrol, Criminal Investigations Division. The title made him pause. "You're not regular patrol?" Rusk shook his head. "I work missing persons and suspected human trafficking cases. Route 9 has been on my radar for 3 years. You're the first person who's called in a report and actually stuck around to talk to us. Most people just keep driving and try to forget what they saw." After Rusk left, Truman sat alone in his cab for a long time, turning the business card over in his hands. The sun was fully up now, the truck stop parking lot filling with morning traffic. He knew he should get back on the road, make up the time he'd lost, deliver his cargo to El Paso. But instead, he found himself thinking about the logbook. Not just the page with his name on it, but the other entries he'd seen. J. Corbin, D. Salazar. Were those real people? Had they stopped at that way station too? And if so, where were they now? He pulled out his phone and opened a search engine, typing in the names one at a time. The results were scattered and inconclusive. A few social media profiles that might or might not be the same people. No news articles. No missing person reports that matched. Either the names were fake, or the people behind them had disappeared so thoroughly that even the internet had forgotten them. Truman was about to close the browser when he noticed a forum post from a trucking community site. The thread was titled, "Weird Experiences on Route 9, Arizona-New Mexico Border." He clicked it open and started reading. The posts went back almost 5 years, and the stories were disturbingly similar to his own. drivers reporting strange signs directing them to unmarked service roads. Abandoned buildings with lights that seemed to turn on and off at random. Vehicles following them for miles before disappearing without explanation. One poster described finding a logbook at an old rest stop with his truck's VIN number already written in it, dated 3 days before he'd even taken the load. Another claimed to have been chased by a pickup with no plates after stopping at a way station that didn't appear on any map. The thread had dozens of replies, some skeptical, others sharing their own encounters. But what struck Truman most was the pattern. Almost every incident happened between mile 185 and mile 200, and almost every driver mentioned the same thing, a feeling of being watched, of being expected. Truman scrolled to the most recent post, dated just 2 weeks ago. The username was NightHollerA7, and the message was short. Drove Route 9 last night. Saw the service road sign at mile 191. Didn't take it, thank God. But I saw something in my mirror after I passed. A truck that looked like mine, same model, same color, turning onto that road. I slowed down to see if they needed help, but when I looked again, there was nothing there, just empty pavement. I don't know what I saw, but I'm never running that road again. Truman had stomach tightened. He thought about the voice he'd heard on the CB, the warning to turn back. Had that been another driver trying to help, or something else? He bookmarked the forum thread and closed his browser, feeling more unsettled than before. Knowledge was supposed to bring clarity, but all he'd found were more questions. Around 9 a.m., Truman finally started his truck and pulled out of the parking lot. He'd rerouted his GPS to take the interstate, adding an extra hour to his drive time. His dispatcher wouldn't be happy, but he'd deal with that later. As he merged onto the highway, he kept checking his mirrors, half expecting to see a dark pickup following him. But the road behind him stayed empty, just a normal stream of morning traffic heading east toward Texas. He was 50 miles past the truck stop when his CB radio crackled to life. At first, it was just static, the usual background noise of a dozen conversations happening on different channels. But then a voice cut through, clear and distinct, speaking directly to him. Truman Vale, Peterbilt 447. You made a mistake last night. Truman's hand shot to the CB mic, but before he could respond, the voice continued. You saw something you weren't supposed to see. You talked to people you weren't supposed to talk to. That makes you a problem. The transmission cut off, replaced by silence. Truman's heart was pounding now, adrenaline flooding his system. He scanned the road around him, nothing but passenger cars and a few other trucks, all of them maintaining normal speed and distance. No dark pickups, no vehicles closing in. He keyed the mic. Who is this? Identify yourself. No response. He tried again on channel 19, then channel 17, then every other frequency he could think of. Nothing. Just dead air. For the next hour, Truman drove in tense silence, his eyes constantly flicking between the road ahead and the mirrors. Every vehicle that came up behind him felt like a threat. Every exit seemed like a potential ambush point. He thought about calling Trooper Rusk, but what would he say? Someone spoke to him on a CB radio? That could have been anyone, anywhere. CB signals could bounce for hundreds of miles under the right atmospheric conditions. It didn't necessarily mean someone was following him. But the voice had known his name, his truck number, and it had referenced last night. By the time Truman reached El Paso and delivered his cargo, the sun was setting. He'd pushed through without stopping, skipping his usual meal break and ignoring his fatigue. The warehouse crew unloaded his trailer in 40 minutes, and Truman signed off on the paperwork with a shaking hand. His next load wasn't scheduled until tomorrow morning, which meant he had the night free. Normally, he'd find a quiet truck stop and catch up on sleep. But tonight, he wanted lights, people, noise, anything that would drown out the silence of his own thoughts. He parked at a busy travel plaza on the edge of the city and walked inside, past rows of slot machines and lottery kiosks, to a small diner tucked in the back. The place was crowded with travelers and local workers, the air thick with the smell of fried food and coffee. Truman took a booth in the corner where he could see the entrance and ordered a burger he didn't really want. While he waited, he pulled out Trooper Rusk's business card and dialed the cell number on the back. Rusk answered on the second ring. "This is Deacon." Truman identified himself and described the CB transmission he'd received. The trooper was quiet for a moment, then asked him to repeat the exact words. When Truman finished, Rusk said, "Could have been a hoax. CB channels aren't secure, and if someone knew you filed a report, they might be trying to scare you into keeping quiet." His tone suggested he didn't entirely believe that explanation, but it was the rational one. Truman pressed him. "Did you send someone out to the way station? Did you find anything?" "We did," Rusk said carefully. The building was empty. No logbook, no police reports on the wall, no signs of recent activity. Just dust and old furniture. Truman felt a surge of frustration. "So you're saying I made it up?" Rusk cut him off. "I'm saying exactly what I told you this morning. These people are careful. They clean up after themselves. But here's something I didn't mention earlier. We found tire tracks in the dirt behind the building. Recent ones, probably from last night. 2 sets, both consistent with a light truck or SUV. We're running the tread patterns, but it's going to take time." That was something, at least. Proof that someone had been there. "What do I do now?" Truman asked. Rusk's answer was the same as before. "Stay on the interstate. Don't engage if anyone contacts you again, and keep me updated if anything else happens." They ended the call, and Truman sat staring at his phone. He felt like he was caught in a story with no resolution, just an endless series of questions leading nowhere. His food arrived, and he forced himself to eat, though every bite tasted like cardboard. Across the diner, a waitress moved between tables, refilling coffee and chatting with regulars. She was older, maybe in her 60s, with short gray hair and a name tag that read Birdie. Truman watched her absently, envying the simplicity of her routine. She probably went home every night to the same house, the same bed, the same safe, predictable life. She didn't have to worry about mysterious way stations, or men in dark pickups, or voices on the radio that knew her name. When Birdie came by to refill his coffee, she noticed his expression. "Long day?" she asked, her tone kind. Truman managed a tired smile, something like that. She lingered for a moment, studying him with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent years reading people. "You're a driver, aren't you? I can always tell. You've got that look, like you're still moving even when you're sitting still." Truman nodded. 20 years on the road. Birdie poured his coffee and set the pot down on the table. "My late husband was a driver. He used to say the hardest part wasn't the driving, it was the things you saw that you couldn't do anything about. He'd come home sometimes with this weight on him, and I knew he'd seen something that bothered him. But he'd never talk about it, just said it was part of the job." Truman looked up at her, surprised by the openness in her voice. "Did he ever tell you what kind of things?" Birdie shook her head. "Not in detail, but I knew it was bad. Accidents mostly, sometimes worse. He quit when he turned 50, said he couldn't take it anymore. We bought a little diner in Alamogordo and ran it for 10 years before he passed." She picked up the coffee pot again, ready to move on to the next table. "If you're carrying something heavy, son, don't carry it alone. Find someone to talk to. It'll eat you up otherwise." She walked away before Truman could respond, leaving him alone with his thoughts and his half-eaten burger. He thought about her words, about the weight drivers carried. He'd always prided himself on being tough, on handling whatever the road threw at him without complaint. But last night had shaken something loose in him, a realization that there were things out there he didn't understand and couldn't control. And for the first time in years, he felt genuinely afraid. He finished his meal in silence, paid his bill, and walked back to his truck. The parking lot was quieter now, the evening crowd thinning out as people continued on their journeys. Truman climbed into his cab and locked the doors, then pulled the curtains closed around the sleeper. Tomorrow, he'd pick up his next load and head north, away from Route 9 and whatever was lurking there. But tonight, he knew he wouldn't sleep easy. Because somewhere in the back of his mind, he could still hear that voice on the CB, calm and certain. You made a mistake last night. And the worst part was, Truman didn't know what mistake he was supposed to have made. Stopping at the way station? Calling the police? Escaping before they could catch him? Or was the mistake simply that he'd survived when others hadn't? And now he knew too much to be allowed to just walk away. He lay down on the bunk, fully clothed, one hand resting on the CB mic clipped to his belt. Outside, the sounds of the truck stop continued. Engines starting, air brakes hissing, the distant chatter of other drivers on their radios. Normal sounds, safe sounds. But Truman couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere out there someone was listening, waiting, and that this wasn't over yet. Truman didn't pick up his next load the following morning. Instead, he sat in his cab at the El Paso Travel Plaza and made a decision that went against every practical instinct he'd developed over 20 years of trucking. He was going back to Route 9. Not to the way station, he wasn't that reckless, but to the area around it. He needed to understand what he'd stumbled into, and more importantly, he needed to know if he was really in danger or if his paranoia was just getting the better of him. The CB transmission had rattled him more than he wanted to admit, but in the clear light of morning, he could almost convince himself it had been a prank or a coincidence. Almost. He spent the morning at a library branch in downtown El Paso, using their public computers to dig deeper into the missing person cases Trooper Rusk had mentioned. The library was quiet, mostly empty except for a few students and elderly patrons reading newspapers. Truman felt conspicuous in his worn jeans and trucking company jacket, but no one paid him any attention. He started with Marcus Holt, the driver who'd disappeared in 2019. Local news archives showed a brief article about his abandoned freightliner being found near mile 188. Hazard lights still flashing. Cargo untouched. Holt was 42, married, father of 3. His wife had been interviewed, pleading for information. The case went cold after 6 weeks. No body, no evidence of foul play, just a truck sitting empty on the shoulder like its driver had stepped out for a cigarette and never came back. Elena Soto's case was even stranger. Her truck had vanished completely. No abandoned vehicle, no cargo recovery, nothing. She'd checked in with her dispatcher at a fuel stop in Deeming, said she'd be taking Route 9 to save time, and was never heard from again. Her GPS tracker showed her route until mile 192. Then the signal went dark. Search teams combed the area for days, even brought in cadaver dogs and a helicopter, but found nothing. It was as if she and her entire rig had been erased from existence. The article mentioned that her family suspected she'd been targeted by cargo thieves, but investigators found no evidence to support that theory. The case remained open, but inactive. Truman searched for the other names he'd seen on those police reports at the way station, but most yielded nothing. Either the reports had been fabricated to scare him, or the cases were too old or too minor to have made the news. But he did find 2 more disappearances that fit the pattern. A tourist named Gerald Vance, who'd gone missing while driving through the area in 2020, and a highway maintenance worker named Raymond Kolb, who'd failed to return from a routine inspection in 2022. Both cases went nowhere. Both happened within 5 miles of mile 191. By noon, Truman had filled 3 pages of a notebook with dates, names, and locations, trying to find a pattern beyond the obvious geographic clustering. Were the disappearances seasonal? No. They'd happened in every month except December and January. Were the victims a specific demographic? No. Young and old, male and female, local and out of state. The only common thread was the location, and the fact that none of them were ever found. It was as if Route 9 had a gravitational pull that swallowed people whole. Truman closed his notebook and stared at the computer screen. The rational part of his brain told him he should let it go, that this was a job for law enforcement, not a truck driver with too much curiosity. But the other part, the part that had seen his name written in a logbook before he'd even arrived, knew he couldn't just walk away. Someone had expected him. Someone had known he'd take that service road, and that meant this wasn't random. It was targeted. He left the library and drove north, retracing his route from 2 nights ago. The interstate was busy with midday traffic, but when he turned onto Route 9, the road emptied out almost immediately. It was strange how quickly the world changed. 1 minute he was surrounded by 18-wheelers and SUVs, radio stations clear and strong. The next, he was alone on a 2-lane highway with nothing but static on the airwaves and miles of empty desert stretching to the horizon. The isolation felt deliberate, like the road itself was designed to make people disappear. Truman slowed as he approached mile 191. In daylight, the service road turnoff looked even less remarkable than it had at night. Just a narrow strip of cracked asphalt branching east, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. The sign he'd seen before was gone. No marker, no arrow, nothing to indicate the road even existed. Truman pulled onto the shoulder and put the truck in park, leaving the engine running. He sat there for several minutes, studying the turnoff through his windshield. The pavement was visible for maybe 50 yards before it curved out of sight behind a low ridge. Beyond that, he could see nothing. No buildings, no vehicles, no movement. He thought about driving down there again, but immediately dismissed the idea. Whatever was at that way station, they knew he'd been there once. Going back would be walking into a trap. Instead, he pulled out his phone and called Trooper Rusk. The call went to voicemail. Truman left a brief message saying he was back at mile 191 and asked Rusk to call him back. Then he sat and waited, watching the service road like it might suddenly produce answers. 20 minutes passed. A few cars drove by on the main highway, their drivers not even glancing at the turnoff. Truman's CB radio crackled occasionally with distant chatter. Truckers coordinating fuel stops. Someone complaining about construction delays near Albuquerque. Normal road talk. Nothing threatening. He was starting to feel foolish for coming back when his phone rang. It was Rusk. "What the hell are you doing?" The trooper's voice was sharp, almost angry. "I told you to stay away from that area." Truman kept his tone calm. "I'm not at the way station. I'm just parked on the highway observing. Have you gotten any new information?" Rusk was silent for a moment, and Truman could hear papers rustling in the background. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, more controlled. "We got results back on those tire tracks. They match a Ford F-250, probably a 2015 or 2016 model, dark blue or black. No plates registered to that description in the area, which means it's either stolen or running illegal tags." "That's something," Truman said. "Did you put out an alert?" Rusk's sigh was audible even over the phone. "We did, but without a plate number or a clear suspect, there's not much we can do. There are thousands of trucks like that in New Mexico alone." He paused, then added, "Look, I know you want answers, but you're putting yourself at risk. These people, whoever they are, they've been operating for years without getting caught. That means they're smart, they're organized, and they don't leave witnesses. You need to go back to El Paso and let us handle this." Truman was about to respond when he saw movement in his side mirror. A vehicle had pulled onto the shoulder about 100 yards behind him. A dark pickup, no front plate visible, engine idling. His chest tightened. "Rusk, I've got company. Dark truck just pulled up behind me." The trooper's voice sharpened. "Can you see the driver?" Truman adjusted his mirror, trying to get a better angle. The truck's windshield was tinted too dark to make out any details. "Negative. Windows are blacked out. Should I move?" "Yes. Get back on the highway and head toward the nearest populated area. Don't stop, don't engage. I'm dispatching a unit to your location now, but they're at least 15 minutes out." Rusk's tone was urgent but controlled. "Stay on the line with me." Truman released the parking brake and eased the Peterbilt forward, merging back onto Route 9. In his mirror, the dark pickup matched his movement, pulling onto the road behind him but maintaining distance, not closing in, not falling back, just following. Truman's pulse quickened. "He's tailing me, about 50 yards back." "Keep your speed steady," Rusk instructed. "Don't do anything that might provoke a confrontation. The unit is en route, ETA 12 minutes. Truman nodded, even though Rusk couldn't see him. 12 minutes felt like an eternity. He watched the speedometer, keeping it right at 55, and kept glancing at his mirrors. The pickup stayed exactly where it was, matching his speed with eerie precision. No attempt to pass, no aggressive maneuvers, just a steady, patient pursuit. It was somehow worse than if they'd tried to run him off the road. This felt calculated. "Rusk, this doesn't feel like road rage. They're not trying to overtake me. They're just watching." Truman's voice was steady, but his hands were slick with sweat on the steering wheel. The trooper's response was grim. "They're testing you, seeing if you'll panic, if you'll make a mistake. Don't give them one, just keep driving." The miles crawled by. Truman passed mile 195, then mile 198. Still, the pickup followed, a dark shadow in his mirrors. He tried to get a look at the license plate, but either it was missing or covered in mud. He couldn't tell which. His CB radio crackled, and for a second he thought it might be another threatening message. But it was just static, the empty hiss of dead air. At mile 203, Truman spotted something up ahead. A rest area, one of the official state-maintained ones with bathrooms and vending machines. There were 2 other vehicles in the lot, a minivan and a sedan, not empty, which meant potential witnesses. Truman made a split-second decision. "I'm pulling into the rest area at mile 203. There are people here, maybe that'll scare them off." Rusk hesitated, then said, "All right. Park near the other vehicles, stay in your cab, and keep your doors locked. The unit is 8 minutes out." Truman signaled and pulled into the rest area, choosing a spot between the minivan and the sedan. The dark pickup followed him into the lot but didn't park. Instead, it made a slow loop around the perimeter, passing close enough that Truman could finally see the driver's side window roll down. A man's face appeared, partially obscured by a baseball cap and sunglasses, but visible enough that Truman could make out a strong jawline and a thin scar running down his left cheek. The man stared directly at Truman, holding his gaze for 3 long seconds. Then he smiled, not friendly, not threatening, just a cold, knowing expression that made Truman's stomach turn. The window rolled back up, and the pickup accelerated out of the lot, heading north on Route 9. Truman exhaled a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "They're gone. Headed north, probably doing 60. Rusk's voice was tense. "Did you get a plate?" Truman shook his head. "No plate. but I saw the driver. White male, maybe late 30s, scar on his left cheek, wearing a cap and sunglasses. Rusk was already taking notes. Good. That's more than we've had before. Stay where you are. The patrol unit is almost there. 5 minutes later, a New Mexico State Police cruiser pulled into the rest area, lights flashing. Truman stepped down from his cab and met the officer, a younger trooper named Alvarez, who took his statement and radioed in the description of the pickup and driver. Alvarez was professional but visibly skeptical, and Truman couldn't blame him. A truck followed you for a few miles and then left. On its own, it wasn't much of a crime. But when Alvarez ran Truman's information and saw the incident report from 2 nights ago, his demeanor shifted. He called Rusk, spoke in low tones for a few minutes, then returned to Truman with a more serious expression. Trooper Rusk wants you to come into the district office. He's got some things he wants to show you, and he thinks you might be able to help identify some other people of interest. Alvarez glanced at Truman's Peterbilt. You okay to drive there, or do you need an escort? Truman shook his head. I can drive. Where's the office? Alvarez gave him the address, a small town called Lordsburg, about 40 miles west. Stick to the interstate, not Route 9. Rusk was very clear about that. An hour later, Truman was sitting in a cramped conference room at the State Police District office in Lordsburg. Trooper Rusk sat across from him, a manila folder open on the table between them. The folder contained photographs, surveillance stills, driver's license photos, mugshots. Rusk slid the first image across the table. Recognize this person? Truman studied the photo. It showed a man in his 40s with thinning hair and a weathered face. He looked vaguely familiar, but Truman couldn't place him. Maybe. I might have seen him at a truck stop or fuel station, but I couldn't say for sure. Rusk nodded and showed him another photo. This one was clearer, a mugshot of a man in his 30s with the same scar Truman had just seen. That's him, Truman said immediately. That's the guy from the pickup. Rusk leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. His name is Victor Salton, ex-military, dishonorably discharged in 2014 for conduct violations. He's got a record: assault, theft, suspected involvement in a smuggling operation out of El Paso. We've had him on our radar for years, but we've never been able to make anything stick. Witnesses disappear, evidence goes missing, and Salton always has an alibi. Truman felt a chill run down his spine. You think he's behind the disappearances? Rusk pulled out another photo, this one showing a group of men standing next to a semi-truck. Salton was among them, along with 2 others Truman didn't recognize. We think he's part of a crew. They target high-value cargo, electronics, pharmaceuticals, anything that can be moved and sold quickly. They use the old way station as a staging area. Drivers get diverted there under false pretenses, and once they're isolated, the crew takes the cargo and disposes of the driver. The bluntness of Rusk's words hit Truman like a punch. You're saying they kill them? Rusk met his eyes. We don't have bodies, so we can't prove it. But 7 people don't just vanish into thin air. And the fact that you're sitting here alive and talking to me makes you an anomaly. You got away. That makes you a witness, and it makes you a liability to them. Truman's throat felt dry. So what do I do? You testify, Rusk said simply. We're building a case, but we need someone who can put Salton at that location and describe what happened. Your testimony, combined with the tire tracks and the CB transmission, might be enough to get a warrant. From there, we can dig deeper, maybe find physical evidence that ties them to the other disappearances. Truman hesitated. And if I testify, what happens to me? Do I get protection, or do I just become a bigger target? Rusk didn't sugarcoat it. I can't promise you'll be safe. These people are dangerous. But I can promise we'll do everything in our power to bring them in before they have a chance to come after you. He tapped the folder. "Right now, you're the best lead we've had in 3 years. I need you to help us close this." Truman thought about the logbook with his name in it, the police reports on the wall, Marcus Holt and Elena Soto and all the others who'd driven down that service road and never come back. He thought about their families, still waiting for answers that might never come. And he thought about the scar-faced man in the pickup, smiling at him like they shared a secret. He couldn't let that stand. "All right," Truman said finally. "I'll testify. Tell me what you need." For the next 2 hours, Rusk walked him through the process. Formal statements, timeline reconstructions, identifying other potential witnesses from the trucking forum Truman had found. They discussed the CB transmission, the logbook, the 2 men who'd tried to break into his truck. Every detail was documented, photographed, recorded. By the time they finished, it was late afternoon, and Truman felt drained. But he also felt something else. Purpose. For the first time since this started, he wasn't just running. He was fighting back. As Truman prepared to leave, Rusk handed him a new business card. This one with an after-hours number and an email address. "If anything happens, anything at all, you contact me immediately. Don't wait, don't second-guess yourself. I'll have patrols increase their presence on Route 9, and I'll put out a bolo for Salton's truck. But you need to be careful. These people are watching, and they know you talk to us." Truman pocketed the card. "I will, and Rusk, thank you for taking this seriously." The drive back to El Paso felt longer than it should have. Truman kept his speed steady, his eyes on the mirrors, his CB radio tuned to Channel 19. Other truckers chattered about weather and traffic, their voices a comforting background noise. He didn't join the conversation, just listened, letting the normalcy of it wash over him. But in the back of his mind, he couldn't stop thinking about Victor Salton's smile, cold and knowing, like a predator sizing up prey. When Truman finally pulled into the travel plaza that night, he parked under the brightest light he could find, nose out, with a clear view of the entrance. He did a full walk-around of his truck, checking every lock, every strap, every panel. Everything was secure, but he didn't feel secure. He felt exposed, like he was standing on a stage with a spotlight on him and 1,000 eyes watching from the darkness beyond. Inside the plaza, he bought a cup of coffee and a sandwich he didn't taste. He sat at a table near the window, his back to the wall, and watched the parking lot. Trucks came and went, drivers moving through their routines with the weary efficiency of people who'd done this 1,000 times. No one paid him any attention. No dark pickups, no suspicious vehicles, no men with scars, just normal people living normal lives. But Truman knew better now. He knew that underneath the surface of this normal, everyday world, there were currents running dark and deep. There were people who saw drivers like him not as human beings, but as opportunities. And there were places like that way station at mile 191, where the rules didn't apply and anything could happen. He'd survived one encounter with that world. He wasn't sure he'd survive another. His phone buzzed with a text from Rusk. Warrant approved. Raiding the location tomorrow at dawn. Stay safe. Truman read the message twice, then put his phone away. Tomorrow, the police would move on the way station. Tomorrow, they might find evidence. Tomorrow, they might start getting answers for the families of Marcus Holt and Elena Soto and all the others. But tonight, Truman was alone with his coffee and his thoughts, and the growing certainty that this wasn't over. Not yet. He finished his meal and returned to his truck, climbing into the sleeper and drawing the curtains. He didn't undress, didn't even take off his boots. He just lay there in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the travel plaza outside. Engines, air brakes, voices, and underneath it all, in the quiet spaces between sounds, He listened for something else. The crunch of gravel, the click of a door latch, the whisper of a voice on the CB saying his name. He told himself he was being paranoid. He told himself the police would handle it. He told himself he was safe. But deep down, in the place where instinct lived, Truman knew the truth. The clock at mile 191 hadn't just stopped for him. It was counting down. And when it reached 0, someone would come to collect. Truman woke to the sound of his phone buzzing on the dashboard. For a disorienting moment, he didn't know where he was. The sleeper berth was dark, the curtains drawn tight, and his neck ached from sleeping in his boots. Then memory crashed back. The way station. Victor Salton. The warrant. He fumbled for his phone, squinting at the screen. 6:14 a.m. The caller ID showed Trooper Rusk's number. Truman answered, his voice rough from sleep. "Yeah. It's Rusk. We just finished the raid." The trooper's voice was flat, drained of emotion. Truman sat up, fully awake now. And there was a long pause on the other end, filled only with the faint static of a bad connection. When Rusk spoke again, his words came slowly, carefully chosen. The building was empty. No logbooks, no police reports, no equipment. Nothing but dust and old furniture just like before. We brought cadaver dogs, checked the surrounding area for graves or dump sites. Nothing. No forensic evidence, no tire tracks this time. No indication anyone's been there in years. Truman's chest tightened. That's impossible. I was there 3 days ago. There were tire tracks, you confirmed it. Rusk's sigh was audible. I know. But either they cleaned the scene completely, or... He trailed off. Truman finished the thought. Or what? Another pause. Or... We're dealing with something more sophisticated than a simple cargo theft operation. The kind of people who have the resources to sanitize a site this thoroughly, this quickly. That's not amateur hour. That's professional. Truman rubbed his face with his free hand, trying to process what he was hearing. What about Salton? Did you pick him up? Rusk's answer was clipped. We tried. His last known address was abandoned. His truck's not registered to him. It's owned by a shell company that doesn't exist on paper. We've got a bolo out, but so far, nothing. It's like he knew we were coming. The implication hung in the air between them. Unspoken but clear. Either someone had tipped Salton off, or he'd been watching closely enough to know when to disappear. So, what now? Truman asked, though he already suspected the answer. Rusk's tone softened slightly. Now, we keep investigating. We'll follow up on the shell company, track financial records, put pressure on known associates. But realistically, without physical evidence or a suspect in custody, this case is going to stall. I'm sorry, Truman. I know that's not what you want to hear. It wasn't. But Truman had been around long enough to know how these things went. Cases went cold, leads dried up, people moved on. What about me? Am I still at risk? I don't know, Rusk admitted. If Salton's smart, and he clearly is, he'll lay low for a while. He knows we're watching now, but that doesn't mean you're safe. It just means the threat might not be immediate. He paused. Keep your head down. Vary your routes. Stay in populated areas, and if you see anything suspicious, call me immediately. They ended the call, and Truman sat in the dim light of his sleeper, staring at nothing. The raid had been his best hope for closure, for answers, for some kind of resolution. And now it was gone, dissolved into the same fog of uncertainty that surrounded everything else about this case. He thought about going home, taking a few days off to clear his head. But home was an empty apartment in Tucson that he barely recognized anymore, and taking time off meant sitting alone with his thoughts, something he'd learned to avoid over the years. The road was better. The road kept him moving, kept him focused on the next delivery, the next mile marker, the next sunrise. So he got dressed, splashed water on his face in the Travel Plaza bathroom, and checked his dispatch for the next available load. His dispatcher had him scheduled for a run to Phoenix, picking up auto parts at a warehouse in Las Cruces. Standard job, interstate all the way. No back roads, no detours. Exactly what he needed. The drive to Las Cruces was uneventful. Morning traffic on I-10 was light, and Truman made good time. He picked up the cargo without incident, signed the paperwork, and was back on the road by noon. Phoenix was 4 hours west, straight shot on the interstate. He'd arrive before dark, drop the load, and find a truck stop for the night. Simple, safe, normal. But as the miles rolled by, Truman couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every vehicle that lingered in his mirrors felt like a potential threat. Every rest area looked like a place where someone might be waiting. He told himself it was paranoia, a natural response to what he'd been through. But knowing it was paranoia didn't make it feel any less real. Around 2 p.m., Truman's CB radio crackled to life. At first, it was just the usual chatter, truckers discussing traffic conditions, someone complaining about a way station backup. But then a voice cut through, clearer than the others, speaking directly into the noise. Peterbilt 447, this is a courtesy call. Truman's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He recognized the phrasing from 3 days ago, the same clinical, detached tone. He grabbed the CB mic. Who is this? Static washed across the channel, then the voice returned. You were given a warning. You chose not to heed it. Choices have consequences, Truman. His pulse hammered in his ears. He scanned the traffic around him. A minivan, 2 sedans, a panel truck, all maintaining normal distances. No dark pickups, no suspicious vehicles. What do you want? Truman kept his voice steady, refusing to show fear even though his entire body was tense. The voice on the CB was unhurried, almost conversational. We want what we've always wanted, to be left alone. But you've made that difficult. You've involved people who ask questions. Questions lead to complications. I didn't see anything, Truman said, knowing it was a lie but hoping it might buy him something. I stopped at an old building, looked around and left. That's all. A soft laugh came through the speaker, devoid of humor. You saw enough, you know enough. And now you've testified. That makes you a problem that needs solving. The transmission ended abruptly, leaving only static. Truman tried to respond, but no one answered. He switched channels, broadcast on 19, 17, even the emergency channel 9. Nothing. The voice was gone. Truman's mind raced. They knew he'd testified, or agreed to testify. That information should have been confidential, known only to Rusk and a handful of other law enforcement personnel, which meant either there was a leak in the department, or these people had access to information they shouldn't. Either possibility was terrifying. He pulled out his phone and called Rusk, but the call went straight to voicemail. Truman left a hurried message describing the CB transmission, then hung up and focused on driving. Phoenix was still 3 hours away. 3 hours of exposure, 3 hours of vulnerability. He considered pulling over, finding a police station or a busy truck stop and waiting for Rusk to call back. But stopping meant being stationary, predictable. At least while he was moving, he had options. So he kept driving, pushing the Peterbilt up to 70, his eyes constantly flicking between the road and his mirrors. The afternoon sun beat down through the windshield, turning the cab into an oven despite the air conditioning. Sweat beaded on Truman's forehead, and his shirt clung to his back. He tried to focus on the road, on the simple mechanics of driving, but his thoughts kept spiraling back to the voice on the CB. Choices have consequences. At 3:30, Truman passed a rest area and spotted a state police cruiser parked near the entrance. Relief flooded through him. He pulled in, maneuvering his rig into a spot where he had a clear view of the cruiser, and climbed down from the cab. The afternoon heat hit him like a wall, dry and oppressive. He walked toward the cruiser, raising one hand in a cautious greeting. The officer inside, a woman in her 30s with short dark hair, rolled down her window. "Something I can help you with?" Truman explained the situation as concisely as he could. The CB transmission, the ongoing investigation, Trooper Rusk's involvement. The officer listened, her expression shifting from mild curiosity to focused concern. She asked for his information, ran his license, and made a call on her radio. After a few minutes, she stepped out of the cruiser. "Trooper Rusk confirms your story. He's advised me to provide an escort to your destination. Where are you headed?" Truman told her Phoenix, and she nodded. "I can take you as far as the county line, then I'll coordinate a handoff to another unit. Stay close, don't stop unless I stop, and keep your CB on channel 19 in case I need to communicate." The escort helped, but it didn't eliminate Truman's anxiety. He followed the cruiser back onto the interstate, maintaining a steady distance behind her flashing lights. Other drivers moved aside, giving them space, and for a while Truman allowed himself to hope that this might actually work, that he'd make it to Phoenix, drop his load, and figure out his next move from there. But hope was a fragile thing, and the road had a way of shattering it. At 4:15, just as they crossed into Maricopa County, Truman's CB radio crackled again. This time the voice was different, younger, edged with impatience. "Peterbilt 447, you're making this harder than it needs to be. Police can't protect you forever." Truman's breath caught. He grabbed the mic. "I've got a state police escort. Whatever you're planning, it's not going to work." A pause, then the voice responded with something that chilled him more than any threat. "We know. We're counting on it." The words were still echoing in Truman's mind when he saw the vehicle ahead. A dark pickup, no plates, pulled onto the shoulder about a quarter-mile up the road. The state police cruiser was already passing it when Truman realized what was happening. The pickup accelerated hard, merging into traffic directly behind the cruiser, inserting itself between Truman and his escort. Truman hit his horn, a long blast to warn the officer, but the cruiser was already too far ahead to see the pickup in her mirrors. And then, with a precision that spoke of planning, the pickup slowed abruptly, forcing Truman to brake hard. His trailer swayed, cargo shifting in the back, and by the time he'd regained control, the cruiser was gone, disappeared around a bend, unaware that she'd lost her charge. Truman was alone on the highway with the dark pickup directly in front of him. He could see the driver now, a silhouette behind tinted glass, one hand resting casually on the window frame. The pickup slowed further, dropping to 45, then 40. Truman's options flashed through his mind. He could try to pass, but the pickup would just match his speed and block him. He could stop completely, but that would leave him vulnerable. Or he could call for help and hope someone arrived before things got worse. He chose the third option, fumbling for his phone while trying to keep one hand on the wheel. But before he could dial, the pickup's brake lights flared, and it came to a complete stop in the middle of the highway. Truman had no choice. He slammed on his brakes, feeling the Peterbilt shudder as the air brakes engaged, the trailer fishtailing slightly before the whole rig ground to a halt. They were stopped in the right lane of I-10, traffic whipping past on the left, horns blaring. The pickup's driver door opened, and a man stepped out, not Victor Salton, but someone else, younger, wearing dark jeans and a black jacket. He walked toward Truman's truck with the calm confidence of someone who knew he had control of the situation. Truman's hand went to the door lock, confirming it was engaged, and he reached for the CB mic. Officer needs assistance, I-10 eastbound near mile marker. He didn't get to finish. The man outside pulled something from his jacket. Not a weapon, but a small rectangular device. He held it up so Truman could see it through the windshield, then pressed a button. Truman's truck died, not gradually, but instantly. Engine cutting out, dash lights going dark, even the CB radio falling silent. For a moment, Truman sat in stunned disbelief, staring at the lifeless controls. Then, understanding hit. A kill switch. They'd installed something on his truck, probably while he'd been inside the travel plaza last night, something that could remotely disable the electronics. He tried the ignition. Nothing. The engine wouldn't even turn over. He was trapped in a dead vehicle in the middle of a busy highway, completely at their mercy. The man outside tapped on the driver's window with one knuckle, the sound sharp and insistent. When Truman didn't respond, the man held up the device again and made a turning motion indicating Truman should roll down the window. Truman shook his head. The man's expression didn't change. He walked around to the passenger side, out of Truman's line of sight. Truman heard a metallic scraping sound, then a louder bang, and realized with sick certainty that they were breaking in. He lunged for his phone, but his hands were shaking so badly he could barely unlock the screen. He managed to dial 911 just as the passenger door wrenched open, and the man climbed into the cab. The 911 operator's voice was tinny and distant. 911, what's your emergency? Truman tried to speak, but the man grabbed the phone from his hand and ended the call with a single swipe. Then he sat back in the passenger seat, studying Truman with cool appraisal. Up close, Truman could see he was young, maybe mid-20s, with pale eyes and a face that held no emotion whatsoever. You should have stayed away, the man said quietly. All of this could have been avoided. Truman's voice came out hoarse. What do you want? The man reached into his jacket again, and this time Truman flinched, expecting a weapon. But instead, the man pulled out a folded piece of paper and set it on the dashboard between them. A reminder. You saw something you weren't supposed to see. You talked to people you weren't supposed to talk to. And now you need to understand the consequences of those choices. He tapped the paper. Open it. With shaking hands, Truman unfolded the paper. It was a photocopy of a police report, one of the ones he'd seen on the wall at the way station. But this time, the name at the top wasn't Marcus Holt or Elena Soto. It was his own, Truman Vale. The report was dated today. Location of incident, I-10 eastbound, mile 184. Status, missing. Last seen operating Peterbilt, 447. No body recovered. Investigation ongoing. The words blurred as Truman stared at them, his mind refusing to process what he was seeing. This was a threat, a preview, a promise of what would happen if he didn't fall in line. The man spoke again, his tone almost gentle. We're not here to hurt you. We're here to give you a choice. You can walk away from this. Tell Trooper Rusk you were mistaken, that you didn't see anything conclusive at the way station. Withdraw your testimony. Move on with your life. Or, he gestured at the paper, you can become another statistic, another driver who disappeared on a lonely stretch of highway. It's your decision. Truman's throat was bone dry. And if I agree, how do I know you won't come after me anyway? The man smiled, and it was the most unsettling thing Truman had seen yet. A smile that didn't reach his eyes, mechanical and empty. You don't. But you have our word that as long as you stay quiet, you're not worth the effort. We have bigger concerns than one truck driver who saw too much. Forget about mile 191. Forget about Victor Salton, and we forget about you. Before Truman could respond, the sound of sirens cut through the air. The man's expression flickered, not fear, but annoyance. He reached over and pressed a button on the device he'd used to kill the truck. The dashboard lights blinked back to life, and Truman heard the engine rumble back to power. The man opened the passenger door and stepped down, pausing to look back at Truman one more time. "Smart choice," he said, as if Truman had already agreed. Then he was gone, jogging back to the pickup. The vehicle roared to life and accelerated onto the shoulder, disappearing into traffic before Truman could even think to note the direction. 2 state police cruisers arrived 30 seconds later, lights flashing, officers rushing to Truman's truck with hands on their holsters. The female officer who'd been escorting him was among them, her face tight with concern and anger. "What happened? Are you hurt?" Truman opened his mouth to tell her everything. The pickup, the man in the cab, the kill switch, the paper that was still sitting on his dashboard. But then he thought about the photocopy with his name on it, the casual certainty in the man's voice, the promise of consequences, and he hesitated. "Truck stalled," he heard himself say. "I don't know why, it just died in the middle of the highway." The lie tasted bitter, but it came out smoothly. The officer frowned, clearly not convinced. "We received a 911 call from this number. Lasted about 2 seconds before it was disconnected. You sure that's all that happened?" Truman nodded, forcing himself to meet her eyes. "Must have been a pocket dial. I was panicking when the truck died. Thought I was going to get rear-ended." The officers searched the area, checked Truman's truck for tampering, and took his statement. They found nothing. The kill switch, if it even existed, was hidden too well for a roadside inspection. Eventually, they let him go with a warning to get his electronics checked at the next service center. Truman drove the remaining hour to Phoenix in silence, his mind replaying the encounter over and over. When he finally reached the warehouse and unloaded his cargo, it was almost dark. He found a truck stop on the outskirts of the city and parked under the lights, but he didn't go inside. He just sat in his cab, staring at the photocopy of the police report with his name on it. His phone rang. Trooper Rusk. Truman stared at the screen for a long moment before answering. "Truman, the officer who escorted you said your truck stalled. You didn't mention anything else? No contact with suspicious vehicles?" Truman's mouth opened, and for a second he was going to tell the truth. But then he thought about the empty raid, the sanitized crime scene, the way Salton had disappeared like smoke. He thought about 7 other people who'd tried to fight back and ended up as names on police reports, their families still waiting for answers that would never come. "No," Truman said finally. "Just a mechanical issue. Truck's running fine now." Rusk was silent for a long moment. "All right, keep me posted if anything changes." They ended the call, and Truman set the phone down. He knew he'd just made a choice. Not the choice he wanted to make, but the only one that felt like it might keep him alive. He thought about Marcus Holt, stopping on the shoulder with his hazard lights flashing. He thought about Elena Soto, checking in at a fuel stop and never being heard from again. He thought about all the others whose names he'd seen on those reports. People who'd encountered something they couldn't understand and paid for it with their lives. And now he was one of them. Not dead, not yet, but marked, compromised. Caught between the law and something that operated outside it. Something with resources and reach and the patience to wait for the right moment. Truman folded the photocopy and tucked it into his logbook, a reminder of the promise that had been made. "As long as you stay quiet." The words echoed in his mind as he finally climbed into the sleeper, too exhausted to undress. Sleep came slowly, interrupted by the sound of engines and footsteps that might have been real or might have been his imagination. 3 weeks later, Truman was still driving. He'd filed his report with the trucking company about the mechanical issue, and they'd sent the Peterbilt to a shop for inspection. The mechanics found nothing wrong. No kill switch, no signs of tampering. Just a healthy truck that had mysteriously stalled and then restarted. Truman didn't push the issue. He took the truck back and returned to his routes, always choosing the interstate, always avoiding Route 9. He stopped checking the trucking forums, stopped searching for news about missing drivers. He didn't call Trooper Rusk, and Rusk didn't call him. But sometimes, late at night when he was alone on a dark stretch of highway, Truman would think about that way station at mile 191. He'd think about the logbook with his name already written in it, the timestamp matching almost exactly when he'd arrived. He'd think about the voice on the CB, calm and certain, and the young man with pale eyes who'd sat in his passenger seat and offered him a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. And he'd wonder if it had been real, the whole thing, every moment, or if it was something else. A warning system, maybe, designed to catch drivers carrying high-value cargo. Or a psychological operation meant to keep people away from something they shouldn't see. Or maybe just what it seemed. A criminal network efficient enough to vanish without a trace, and ruthless enough to make people disappear. Truman would never know for sure, and that uncertainty was its own kind of prison, more effective than any cell. Because every time he saw a mile marker ending in 191, every time a dark pickup appeared in his mirrors, every time his CB radio crackled with unexpected static, he'd wonder if this was the moment when his time ran out. When the clock that had stopped at mile 191 finally started counting down for him. He'd made his choice. He'd stayed quiet. But deep down, in the part of him that had driven trucks for 20 years and learned to trust his instincts, Truman knew the truth. They were still watching. They were always watching. And one day when he'd outlived his usefulness or made another mistake or simply became too much of a risk, they'd come back. Maybe it would be on a lonely highway at midnight. Maybe at a rest stop with broken lights. Maybe at a way station that didn't appear on any map. But they'd come. And when they did, there'd be no escape this time. No police escort, no witnesses, no second chances. Just another name added to the list of drivers who'd seen something they shouldn't have and disappeared without a trace. Until then, Truman drove. Through the day and into the night, across state lines and empty deserts, past mile markers that blurred into an endless succession of numbers. He drove because it was the only thing he knew how to do. And because as long as he kept moving, as long as he stayed on the interstates and away from the back roads, he could almost convince himself that he was still in control, that the choice had been his, that he was safe. But on quiet nights, when the road stretched empty ahead and the darkness pressed close, Truman would remember the photocopy tucked into his logbook. His name, his truck, today's date. A report filed before the crime had even been committed. A clock stopped at a time that hadn't yet arrived. And he'd know, with the cold certainty that comes from surviving something you were never meant to survive, that some roads, once traveled, can never be forgotten. Some detours lead to places you can never truly leave, and some warnings, no matter how clearly heard, come too late to matter. Mile 191 was out there, somewhere in the desert darkness. The way station was still standing, empty and waiting, and the people who used it were still operating, still diverting trucks, still making drivers disappear. Trooper Rusk was still investigating, still looking for evidence that would never be found. And Truman was still driving, still checking his mirrors, still listening for voices on the CB that knew his name. The story didn't have an ending. It just had a pause, a breath held too long, a question that would never be answered. And maybe that was the most terrifying part of all. Merritt Quayle had been driving through rain for the last 90 miles, and it showed no signs of letting up. The storm had rolled in just past the Oklahoma border. turning the evening sky a bruised purple-black and reducing visibility to whatever his headlights could cut through. Water sheeted across the windshield faster than the wipers could clear it, and every few minutes a gust of wind would hit the Kenworth broadside, making the trailer sway. This was the kind of weather that made even veteran drivers nervous, not dangerous enough to pull over, but bad enough that you couldn't afford to let your attention drift for even a second. The highway stretched ahead through flat plains country, fields of corn and sorghum on either side disappearing into the darkness and rain. U.S. Route 183 wasn't a major trucking corridor. Most drivers preferred the Interstate 50 miles east, but Merritt had taken this route specifically because it was quieter. After 23 years behind the wheel, he'd learned to appreciate empty roads and solitude. The CB radio mounted above his head crackled with occasional static but remained mostly silent. In weather like this, most truckers were too busy concentrating to chat. Merritt kept his speed at a careful 55, watching for standing water and debris that might have washed onto the pavement. The digital clock on his dashboard read 9:47 p.m. He'd been on the road since 6 that morning, hauling agricultural equipment from Kansas City down to Amarillo. The load was heavy but well-balanced, and the Kenworth handled it without complaint despite the weather. Merritt's original plan had been to stop for the night at a truck plaza near Dodge City, but he'd made better time than expected and decided to push on. Now, with the storm intensifying and fatigue starting to creep into his shoulders, he was beginning to regret that decision. His GPS showed a small town called Harmony Grove about 15 miles ahead. He didn't remember much about it, probably just a gas station and maybe a diner, but it would have to do. The rain intensified, drumming on the roof of the cab like 1,000 fingers tapping impatiently. Lightning flickered in the distance, brief flashes that illuminated the flat landscape in stark white relief before plunging it back into darkness. Thunder followed seconds later, a low rumble that Merritt felt more than heard. He leaned forward slightly, peering through the windshield, and that's when he saw them. Lights. Red taillights, 2 sets, maybe a quarter mile ahead. They appeared suddenly through the rain, glowing like embers in the darkness, and Merritt felt a small surge of relief. Another vehicle meant he wasn't completely alone out here. He maintained his distance, not wanting to crowd whoever was ahead of him in these conditions. The lights stayed steady, moving at roughly the same speed he was. After a few minutes, Merritt realized there were actually 3 sets of lights, not 2. 3 vehicles traveling close together, which suggested a convoy. That wasn't uncommon among truckers, especially in bad weather. There was safety in numbers, and if one rig ran into trouble, the others could help or at least call for assistance. Merritt considered reaching for his CB to see if the convoy was on any of the standard channels, but before he could, the lights ahead began to fade. Not like they were pulling away, but like they were being slowly erased by the rain. Merritt blinked hard, rubbing his eyes with one hand while keeping the other on the wheel. When he looked again, the lights were gone completely. The road ahead was empty, just rain and darkness, and the hypnotic sweep of his own headlights. He frowned, confused. There hadn't been any turnoffs, no side roads visible through the storm. The highway here was straight as a ruler, and he'd been watching those lights for at least 3 or 4 minutes. Vehicles didn't just disappear, not unless they'd somehow pulled off the road without him noticing. But there was nowhere to pull off. Just ditches on either side and open farmland beyond. Merritt slowed slightly, scanning the shoulders for any sign of the vehicles. Nothing. No brake lights, no hazard flashers, no shapes pulled over in distress. Just empty pavement glistening with rain. He picked up his CB mic and keyed it, his voice cutting through the static. "This is Kenworth southbound on 183, mile marker 94. Anyone else out here tonight?" He released the button and waited. Static hissed back at him. punctuated by occasional pops and crackles. No response. He tried again on channel 19, then channel 17. Still nothing. Either there was no one else on this stretch of road, or the storm was interfering with transmissions. A particularly violent gust of wind slammed into the truck, and Merritt had to correct the wheel to keep from drifting into the other lane. The rain was getting worse, coming down so hard now that his wipers were almost useless. Visibility dropped to maybe 50 feet, and Merritt considered pulling over to wait it out. But the shoulder here was narrow, and stopping in zero visibility conditions was asking to get rear-ended by someone who didn't see him in time. Better to keep moving slowly than to become a stationary target. The mile markers crawled past. Mile 95, mile 96, mile 97. Each one appeared briefly in his headlights, rainwater streaming down the reflective numbers, before vanishing back into the storm. Merritt's hands were starting to ache from gripping the wheel so tightly, and his eyes burned from the strain of trying to see through the downpour. He was seriously considering finding a wide spot to pull over when his headlights caught something ahead on the right shoulder. A building, low and rectangular, set back maybe 20 yards from the road. Merritt's first thought was that it might be a rest area, but as he drew closer he realized it was too small for that. It looked more like an abandoned gas station, or maybe an old way station, the kind that state highway departments used to operate before they moved everything to the interstate. Without really thinking about it, Merritt flipped on his turn signal and eased the Kenworth onto the shoulder, his tires churning through standing water as he guided the rig toward the building. Getting out of the rain for a few minutes, even in an abandoned structure, was better than trying to push through this mess. He pulled into what had once been a parking area, now cracked and overgrown with weeds pushing through the asphalt. His headlights illuminated the building's front. Concrete block walls painted a faded tan, a rusted metal awning that had partially collapsed, dark windows that might have been boarded up from the inside. A weathered sign hung crooked above the entrance, but whatever text had been painted on it had long since faded to illegibility. Merritt set the parking brake and killed the engine, suddenly aware of how loud the rain sounded without the rumble of the diesel to cover it. Water hammered on the roof and hood, a relentless percussion that made the cab feel smaller, more isolated. He sat for a moment, catching his breath and letting the tension drain from his shoulders. Through the rain-streaked windshield he could barely make out the building's entrance, a door that hung slightly ajar, darkness visible beyond. Not exactly inviting, but at least it would offer shelter from the storm if he needed to stretch his legs. He was reaching for his rain jacket when his CB radio crackled to life. This time, it wasn't just static. A voice came through, male and distorted, the words barely audible beneath layers of interference. Convoy westbound, requesting weather check, mile 92. Merritt grabbed the mic and keyed it quickly. This is southbound Kenworth at mile 98. You said westbound convoy? I thought I saw your lights a few minutes ago. What's your 20? He released the button and waited, but the response that came back made no sense. The voice was clearer now, but wrong somehow. The cadence was off, too slow, and there was an echo quality that made it sound like it was coming from the bottom of a well. Westbound convoy, mile 92. Heavy fog. Can't see the road, need guidance. Merritt frowned. Fog? There was no fog. Just rain, torrential rain. And the accent was strange, the phrasing formal in a way that felt out of place. Modern truckers didn't say requesting weather check or need guidance. They said things like, how's it looking ahead? Or, can anyone see through this crap? Merritt tried again. Convoy, you said mile 92? I'm at 98, about 6 miles south of you. Conditions here are heavy rain, no fog. Are you sure about your location? This time, the response came faster, and it sent a cold prickle down Merritt's spine. Mile 92. 3 trucks. Can't see the markers. Think we're lost. Radio's not working right. If anyone can hear this, we need... The transmission cut off abruptly, replaced by static so loud Merritt flinched and turned down the volume. He sat staring at the radio, trying to process what he'd just heard. 3 trucks. That matched what he'd seen. 3 sets of taillights before they vanished. But something was deeply wrong about that transmission. The voice, the phrasing, the mention of fog when there clearly wasn't any, and the way it had cut off mid-sentence, like someone had pulled the plug. Merritt keyed the mic again. "Convoy at mile 92, do you copy? This is Kenworth at mile 98, I'm hearing you, but your transmission is breaking up. What's your call sign?" Nothing. Just static, and beneath it, a faint sound that might have been music, or might have been his imagination, something distant and tinny, like an old AM radio playing in another room. Merritt released the mic and rubbed his face with both hands. He was tired, that was all. Tired and stressed from driving through a storm for the last 2 hours. The lights he'd seen had probably just been local traffic that turned off onto some farm road he hadn't noticed. The CB transmission was likely bouncing off the atmosphere, picking up some old recording or a conversation from miles away. There were explanations for everything if you looked for them. But even as he told himself this, Merritt couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He looked at the building again, at the dark windows and the sagging awning and the door hanging open like a mouth. This place had been closed for years, maybe decades. No one maintained it, no one visited it. So why did it feel like someone was inside, watching him? He shook his head, dismissing the thought as paranoia. The storm was making him jumpy, that was all. He decided to do a quick walk around before settling in for a break. Storms like this could last for hours, and if he was going to wait it out here, he wanted to make sure his cargo was secure and his trailer hadn't taken any damage from the wind. Merritt grabbed his rain jacket and a heavy-duty flashlight from the door pocket, then pushed open the cab door. The wind immediately tried to tear it from his grasp, and rain lashed his face the moment he stepped down onto the running board. He pulled up his hood and jumped down to the pavement, his boots splashing in a puddle that was deeper than he'd expected. The temperature had dropped significantly. What had been a warm evening before the storm now felt cold and damp, the kind of chill that seeped through clothing and settled in your bones. Merritt clicked on the flashlight and swept it across the parking area. His truck sat hulking and dark except for the running lights, rain streaming off every surface. Beyond it, barely visible through the downpour, was the building. And now that he was outside, Merritt could see something he'd missed from the cab. There was light coming from inside. Not bright, but a faint, flickering glow visible through cracks in the boarded-up windows. Probably just lightning reflecting off something, or maybe an electrical short in old wiring, but it was enough to make him hesitate. Merritt completed his walk around quickly, checking straps and tire pressure by feel as much as sight. Everything looked good. The load was secure, no obvious damage, no leaks or flats. He should have climbed back into the cab, locked the doors, and waited out the storm in relative comfort. That would have been the smart thing to do. But something about that flickering light bothered him. If there was an electrical problem in the building, it could start a fire. And if there were people inside, squatters or homeless folks taking shelter from the storm, they'd be in danger. Against his better judgment, Merritt walked toward the building, his flashlight beam cutting through the rain. The door was wooden, swollen from moisture, and it scraped against the concrete floor when he pushed it open wider. The smell hit him immediately, mildew and old paper and something else underneath, something chemical and unpleasant. He stepped inside, out of the rain, and swept his flashlight across the interior. It was a single large room, maybe 30 feet square, with a concrete floor and cinder block walls. Trash littered the corners. old soda cans, fast food wrappers, a few beer bottles. Graffiti covered the walls in layers, tags, and profanity, and crude drawings faded to near invisibility. In the center of the room sat an old metal desk, its surface warped and rusted. And on the desk, impossibly, was a CB radio. Not a modern unit, but an old base station model from the 1980s, the kind with analog dials and a large microphone on a coiled cord. It was powered on. Merritt could see the faint glow of the channel indicator and hear the low hiss of static coming from the speaker. But there was no visible power source, no electrical outlet, no battery pack, no generator. The radio simply sat there, glowing softly in the darkness, as if it had been waiting for him. Merritt's rational mind told him to leave, to turn around and walk back to his truck and forget about this place, but his curiosity was stronger. He approached the desk slowly, his footsteps echoing off the bare walls. The radio's static grew louder as he got closer, and he could hear that faint music again, something that sounded like a country song from decades ago, so distorted he couldn't make out the words. The channel indicator showed 19, the standard trucker frequency. Merritt reached out and touched the microphone. It was cold, almost icy, despite the humid air in the building. Without quite knowing why, he picked up the mic and keyed it. "This is Kenworth southbound on 183, mile 98. Anyone copying?" His voice echoed strangely in the empty room, and for a moment there was no response. Then the radio crackled, and that same voice from earlier came through, clearer now, almost as if the speaker were standing right next to him. "Convoy westbound, mile 92. We've been trying to reach someone for hours. Where are you?" Merritt's hand tightened on the microphone. "I'm 6 miles south of your position. What do you mean, hours? I only heard your first transmission 10 minutes ago." A pause filled with that uncomfortable static. Then, 10 minutes? "No, we've been calling for help since... The voice trailed off, and when it came back it sounded confused, almost frightened. "What year is it?" The question was so unexpected that Merritt almost laughed. "What year? It's 2025. What kind of question is that?" Another long pause. When the voice spoke again, it was barely a whisper. 2025, that's not possible. We left Kansas City on March 14th, 1983. It's been one night. Just one long night. Merritt's blood went cold. He looked down at the radio, at the outdated equipment that shouldn't be working, at the glow of the channel indicator in the darkness. "This isn't funny," he said, his voice shakier than he'd intended. "I don't know what kind of joke this is, but..." The voice cut him off, urgent now. "It's not a joke. We're lost. We've been driving through fog for hours and the road just keeps going. We can't find an exit. We can't find anything, just mile marker 92 over and over. Please, if you can hear us, we need help. We need someone to guide us out." Merritt released the microphone and took a step back from the desk. His flashlight beam wavered as his hand started to shake. This couldn't be real. It had to be a prank, or a recording, or some kind of atmospheric phenomenon that made old radio transmissions come through decades later. But the voice sounded so genuine, so desperate. And the mention of 1983, that was more than 40 years ago, long before Merritt had even started trucking. He was about to respond when another sound cut through the static. A long, mournful note that Merritt recognized immediately. An air horn. Not from his truck, but from somewhere outside, somewhere close. He spun toward the door, his flashlight illuminating the rain-soaked parking area beyond. And there, just visible through the downpour, were lights. 3 sets of headlights, old and yellowish. Not the bright white halogens of modern trucks. They were parked in a line on the shoulder of the highway, maybe 50 yards from where Merritt's Kenworth sat. 3 trucks, their shapes barely visible through the rain, their engines idling with a sound that was deeper and rougher than what you'd hear from a contemporary diesel. Merritt's heart hammered in his chest. Those trucks hadn't been there when he'd pulled in. He'd have seen them, heard them. But now they sat there, silent except for the rumble of their engines and the hiss of rain hitting hot metal. As he watched, one of the cab doors opened, and a figure climbed down. Merritt couldn't make out details through the rain, just a silhouette moving toward the building, moving toward him. He backed away from the door, his flashlight beam wild and unsteady. The CB radio on the desk crackled again, and the voice spoke one more time. "We see you. We see your light. Are you the one who can help us? Can you show us the way out?" Merritt's mouth was too dry to answer. He turned and ran for the back of the building, looking for another exit. But there was only one door, the one he'd come through. The one where the figure was now standing, silhouetted against the rain, looking in at him with eyes he couldn't see but could feel on his skin like a physical touch. "Please," the voice on the radio whispered. "We've been lost for so long. Don't leave us here. Don't leave us in the fog." And that's when Merritt realized what was wrong with what he was seeing. The 3 trucks outside, the figure in the doorway, they weren't surrounded by rain. They were surrounded by fog. Thick, gray fog that swirled and eddied around them. Fog that had nothing to do with the storm that was currently drowning everything else in water. Fog that shouldn't exist, couldn't exist, but was there anyway. Rolling closer, reaching toward the building like fingers stretching out to grab him. Merritt burst through the door and into the rain, his boots splashing through puddles as he ran for his Kenworth. Behind him, he could hear something. Not footsteps exactly, but a sound like fabric dragging across wet pavement. Slow and deliberate. He didn't look back. His hands were shaking so badly it took him 3 tries to get the door open, and when he finally hauled himself into the cab, he immediately hit the lock button and started the engine. The diesel roared to life, and Merritt threw the transmission into gear without bothering to check his mirrors. He just wanted distance between himself and that building, between himself and whatever was standing in that doorway. The Kenworth lurched forward, tires spinning briefly on the wet asphalt before finding purchase. Merritt guided the rig back onto the highway, his headlights cutting through the rain. He risked one glance in his side mirror and saw the building receding into the darkness. The 3 trucks were still there, barely visible through the storm, their lights dim and yellowish. And the fog, that impossible thick fog, still coiled around them like something alive. Then the rain intensified, a wall of water that obscured everything, and when Merritt looked again, the scene was gone. Just empty highway behind him, as if the building and the trucks had never existed at all. He drove for 5 miles without slowing, his heart hammering against his ribs, his hands locked on the steering wheel. The CB radio in his cab was silent now, just the normal hiss of static on Channel 19. No distorted voices, no pleas for help, no mention of convoys lost in 1983. Merritt's rational mind was trying to reassert itself, offering explanations. He'd been driving for 15 hours. Fatigue could cause hallucinations. The storm, the isolation, the stress of poor visibility, all of it could have contributed to seeing things that weren't there. The CB transmission could have been a prank. Someone playing a recording through a pirate station. The building could have been exactly what it looked like. An abandoned structure where his imagination, fueled by exhaustion, had run wild. But the fog, he couldn't explain the fog. Not in the middle of a rainstorm, not when the temperature was still in the 60s. Fog required specific conditions. Cool air over warm ground, humidity, stillness. You didn't get fog during a thunderstorm. It was meteorologically impossible. And yet, he'd seen it. Thick and gray, and moving with purpose, surrounding those old trucks like a barrier between them and the rest of the world. Merritt's hands were still trembling when he spotted lights ahead. Real lights this time. The fluorescent glow of a gas station, bright and modern and blessedly ordinary. A green and white sign identified it as a travel stop, and beneath that a smaller sign read, Harmony Grove, Pop, 847. Merritt pulled into the parking lot and found a spot away from the pumps, near the edge of the lot where he could see both the highway and the store entrance. He killed the engine and sat for a moment, trying to calm his breathing. The rain was still coming down hard, drumming on the roof, but here under the station's lights, it felt manageable, normal. Through the store windows he could see a clerk behind the counter and a couple of customers browsing the aisles. Normal people doing normal things. The sight was so comforting that Merritt almost laughed. He grabbed his rain jacket and made a run for the entrance, pushing through the door into air-conditioned warmth. The clerk looked up, a woman in her 50s with gray hair pulled back in a ponytail and tired eyes that suggested she'd been working the night shift for too many years. "Rough night out there," she said, more statement than question. Merritt nodded, peeling off his wet jacket. "You could say that. How far back does this storm system extend?" The woman glanced at a small television mounted behind the counter, where a weather map showed a massive green and red blob covering half of Oklahoma. "They're saying it'll pass through by midnight, but I've seen worse stick around for days. You look like you could use some coffee." It wasn't a question. She poured him a cup from a pot that looked like it had been sitting for hours, and Merritt accepted it gratefully. The coffee was terrible, burnt and bitter, but it was hot, and that was enough. He took a long sip, feeling the warmth spread through his chest, grounding him back in reality. "You see much traffic tonight?" Merritt asked, trying to sound casual. The clerk shook her head. "You're the first truck in over an hour. Most drivers have the sense to pull over when it gets this bad." She studied him more closely. "You look like you've had a scare. Everything all right?" Merritt hesitated, unsure how to answer. He settled for a partial truth. "Stopped at an old building about 10 miles back. Abandoned place, looked like maybe an old rest stop. Gave me the creeps." The woman's expression changed, something flickering across her face. Recognition, maybe, or concern. 10 miles north? Concrete block building with a rusted awning?" Merritt nodded, and the clerk set down the coffee pot with a little more force than necessary. "That'd be the old Harper station. It's been closed since before I moved here, and that was 23 years ago. Most people don't even know it's there." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "There are stories about that place. Old stories." Merritt felt a chill that had nothing to do with his wet clothes. "What kind of stories?" The clerk glanced toward the other customers, a young couple looking at snacks, then lowered her voice. "Back in the 80s, there was a bad accident on that stretch of highway. March of '83, during a freak fog storm. 3 trucks went off the road, one right after the other, like they were following each other blind. All 3 drivers died. They say the fog came out of nowhere so thick you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. By the time it cleared, those trucks were in the ditch and the drivers, well, they didn't suffer, at least." Merritt's coffee cup froze halfway to his lips. 3 trucks, March 1983. The clerk nodded. It was a big deal at the time. Made the news, shut down the highway for days while they investigated. They never figured out what caused the fog. Weather Service said conditions weren't right for it. Some people thought it might have been smoke from a chemical spill, but they never found evidence of that either. Eventually, they just called it a freak weather event and moved on. She crossed her arms. "But people around here remember. And they say on certain nights when the weather's bad, you can still see lights out by Harper Station. Trucks that aren't really there." Merritt set his cup down carefully, trying to keep his hand steady. "Have you ever seen them?" The clerk shook her head. "I don't drive that route at night if I can help it, but I know people who have. My cousin saw lights there about 5 years ago, said they looked like old semis from the 80s, just sitting on the shoulder with their engines running. He went back the next day in daylight and there was nothing there. No tire tracks, no oil stains, nothing." She gave Merritt a long look. "You saw something out there, didn't you?" Merritt wanted to deny it, to laugh it off and change the subject. But the clerk's eyes were kind, and something about her matter-of-fact tone made him feel like she'd believe him. "I saw trucks," he said quietly. 3 of them. Old models, surrounded by fog. And I heard a voice on a CB radio, someone saying they were lost, asking for help. They said it was 1983. The clerk didn't look surprised. If anything, she looked sad. "That sounds about right. Like I said, old stories. This town's full of them." Before Merritt could respond, the door opened and another man entered, shaking rain from his jacket. He was in his early 60s, barrel-chested, with a weathered face and the kind of bearing that suggested either military or law enforcement. He nodded to the clerk. "Evening, Rita." His eyes moved to Merritt, taking in the truck driver's gear and wet clothes. "You the Kenworth out in the lot?" Merritt nodded. The man extended a hand. "Sheriff Calder Knox. Saw your rig and figured I'd check in, make sure you're not having any trouble. This storm's brought down a few trees and power lines north of here." Merritt shook the sheriff's hand, noting the firm grip and the calluses of someone who worked with his hands. "Merritt Quayle. I'm fine, just waiting out the weather." Knox studied him for a moment, the kind of assessing look that cops develop after years on the job. "You look a little rattled, if you don't mind my saying. Run into something on the road?" Rita, the clerk, spoke up before Merritt could answer. "He stopped at Harper Station." Knox's expression shifted, hardening slightly. "Did he now?" It wasn't a question. The sheriff pulled out a stool and sat down heavily. "What did you see out there?" Merritt glanced at Rita, who gave him an encouraging nod, then back to Knox. Something about the sheriff's tone suggested this wasn't idle curiosity. "I saw 3 trucks. Old ones, maybe from the 80s. They were surrounded by fog, which didn't make sense given the rain. And I heard a CB transmission from someone claiming to be part of a convoy that got lost in 1983. He waited for Knox to laugh or tell him he was crazy, but the sheriff just nodded slowly. "March 14th, 1983. I was a deputy back then, first on the scene. Found those 3 trucks in the ditch, drivers already gone. It was the strangest thing I've ever responded to, and I've been in law enforcement for 40 years. Knox pulled off his cap and ran a hand through his thinning gray hair. "The fog that night was unnatural. I don't mean that in a spooky way. I mean it literally didn't make sense. It was warm, no wind, and suddenly this fog bank rolled in like a wall, thick as cotton, cold as ice. It sat over that stretch of highway for maybe an hour, then lifted just as fast as it came. When it cleared, we found the trucks." He looked at Merritt directly. "You're not the first person to report seeing lights out there, or hearing voices on the CB. It happens every few years, usually during storms." Merritt felt his skepticism warring with what he'd experienced. "You're saying it's... what, ghosts?" Knox shrugged. "I'm saying I don't know what it is. I'm a practical man, Mr. Quayle. I deal in facts and evidence. But I can't explain what happened that night in '83, and I can't explain why people keep reporting the same things at Harper Station. The trucks, The fog, the CB transmissions. It's always the same details, like everyone's seeing the same thing. He leaned forward. What I can tell you is that you're not crazy, and you're not the only one. Whatever's out there, it's real enough that it keeps happening. Rita refilled Merritt's coffee without being asked. Old Alma Drury might be able to tell you more. She worked at Harper Station back when it was still open, before the accident. She's in her 80s now, lives over on Elm Street, sharp as a tack, remembers everything. Knox nodded. Alma's been going on about that place for years, claims there was something wrong with it even before the accident, though she could never say exactly what. If you want answers, she's your best bet. He stood and put his cap back on. But if you're smart, Mr. Quayle, you'll finish your coffee, wait for the storm to pass, and keep driving. Some questions don't have good answers. Merritt sat in the gas station for another 20 minutes, drinking bad coffee and trying to decide what to do. The rational thing would be to follow Knox's advice. Leave town. Get back on the highway. Forget about Harper Station and the impossible fog and the voices on the CB. He had a delivery to make in Amarillo, a schedule to keep. Getting involved in local mysteries wasn't part of his job description. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw those 3 trucks sitting on the shoulder, their lights dim and old, surrounded by that unnatural fog. And he heard that voice on the radio, desperate and lost, asking for help, asking someone to show them the way out. The rain was still falling when Merritt left the gas station, but it had lessened to a steady drizzle. He climbed into his Kenworth and sat for a moment. Engine idling, windshield wipers sweeping back and forth. He pulled out his phone and searched for Alma Drury, Harmony Grove, Oklahoma. The first result was a white pages listing with an address on Elm Street. Merritt stared at it for a long moment, then put the truck in gear and followed his GPS through the small town's quiet streets. Harmony Grove was one of those prairie towns that time seemed to have forgotten. Most of the storefronts on Main Street were dark or boarded up, victims of the interstate bypass that had pulled traffic away 30 years ago. The houses were small and well-maintained, with neat yards and porches lit by yellow bug lights. Elm Street turned out to be on the eastern edge of town, where the pavement gave way to gravel and the streetlights were spaced farther apart. Merritt found the house number he was looking for, a small white bungalow with blue shutters and a porch swing that rocked gently in the wind. It was almost 11 p.m., late for an unannounced visit, but a light was on in the front window. Merritt killed the engine and sat for a moment, second-guessing himself. What was he going to say? That he'd seen ghost trucks and heard voices from 1983? That he wanted to know why Harper Station seemed to be some kind of focal point for the impossible? Before he could talk himself out of it, Merritt grabbed his jacket and walked up the porch steps. He knocked twice, then waited. The woman who answered the door was small and slight. With white hair cut short and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing, she wore a cardigan over a house dress and held a cup of tea in one wrinkled hand. If you're selling something, the answer's no. If you're with the church, I've already got one. And if you're lost, the highway's 3 blocks west. Her voice was crisp and no nonsense, but not unkind. Merritt managed a tired smile. None of the above, ma'am. My name's Merritt Quayle. I'm a truck driver, and I had an experience tonight at Harper Station. Sheriff Knox and Rita at the gas station said you might be able to help me understand what I saw. Alma Drury's expression shifted, the sharpness softening into something that looked like resignation. Harper Station. She sighed and opened the door wider. You'd better come in then. It's too late and too wet to have this conversation on the porch. Merritt followed her into a living room that smelled like old books and lavender. The furniture was dated but immaculate, and the walls were covered with photographs. family pictures spanning decades, a wedding portrait from the 1960s, grandchildren and great-grandchildren at various ages. Alma gestured for him to sit on the sofa while she settled into a rocking chair across from him. "Tell me what you saw," she said, setting her tea down on a side table. "And don't leave anything out." So Merritt told her everything. The lights on the highway that disappeared, the abandoned building, and the CB radio that shouldn't have been working. The voice claiming to be from a convoy lost in 1983. The 3 trucks surrounded by fog in the middle of a rainstorm. When he finished, Alma was quiet for a long moment, her fingers steepled beneath her chin. "I worked at Harper Station from 1979 to early 1983, she said finally. It was a way station and rest stop, mostly used by truckers avoiding the interstate. Nice enough place, kept clean, always had coffee on, but there was something wrong with it, even back then. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the feeling was there, like the building was waiting for something." She paused, her eyes distant. "We'd get strange CB transmissions sometimes, voices that didn't sound quite right, asking for directions or help. At first we thought it was just atmospheric interference. Happens all the time with radio, but the voices were always the same. Always asking how to get out, how to find the highway, saying they were lost in fog." Merritt leaned forward. "But the accident didn't happen until March of '83. Were there transmissions before that?" Alma nodded. "For months before. Maybe even a year. We'd hear them late at night, mostly. Garbled voices on the CB saying they couldn't see the road, couldn't find mile markers. My supervisor reported it to the State Highway Department, but they didn't find anything wrong with the equipment. They said it was probably truckers pranking each other." She picked up her tea again, her hands steady despite her age. "Then came March 14th. I wasn't working that night. I'd gone home around 6 and the weather was fine. But around 9 p.m., I got a call from my supervisor saying there'd been a massive fog bank and a terrible accident. 3 trucks had gone into the ditch almost simultaneously. All 3 drivers dead. Rita at the gas station mentioned it was a freak weather event," Merritt said. Alma's expression darkened. "That's what they called it officially. But I talked to the first responders, and they all said the same thing. The fog wasn't natural, it was too thick, too cold, and it seemed to move with purpose. When it lifted, those trucks were sitting in the ditch like they'd been placed there. No skid marks, no signs of panic braking, just 3 rigs, off the road, drivers gone." She set her cup down with a soft click. "The state closed Harper Station a month later. Said it was for budget reasons, but I knew better. They wanted that place shut down because they couldn't explain what had happened there." Merritt felt a chill run through him despite the warm room. "Do you think those drivers, the ones from 1983, are still out there somehow? Trapped?" Alma's blue eyes met his. "I think something happened at Harper Station that night. Something that broke the normal rules. Time, space, reality. Call it what you want. Those drivers got caught in it, and they've been trying to find their way back ever since. The CB transmissions, the lights people see, the fog, it's all them. Still looking for the highway, still asking for help." She leaned back in her rocker. "I've heard the stories over the years. People like you, stopping at that building and seeing things they can't explain. I always tell them the same thing. There's nothing you can do for those drivers. They're beyond help now. The best thing is to stay away and let them be." "But what if there's a way to help them?" Merritt heard himself say. "What if there's something that could guide them out, show them the way back?" Alma shook her head sadly. "You can't guide someone out of a place that doesn't exist anymore. That fog, that night in 1983, it's gone. But somehow, those drivers are still in it, still experiencing that same moment over and over. It's like they're caught in a loop, and nothing from our world can reach them. She stood slowly, signaling that the conversation was over. Go back to your truck, Mr. Quayle. Get back on the highway and keep driving. Don't go looking for Harper Station again. Some roads, once you leave them, you should never return to. Merritt left Alma Drury's house with more questions than answers. He sat in his Kenworth for a long time, the engine running, the wipers pushing away the light drizzle. Everything Alma had said made a kind of terrible sense. The transmissions he'd heard, the desperation in that voice, it wasn't happening in real time. It was an echo, a recording of something that had already occurred 42 years ago, playing on an endless loop. Those drivers weren't calling for help now. They were still calling for help from March 14th, 1983, unaware that decades had passed and they were long dead. But that didn't explain the fog, or the figures he'd seen, or the feeling that something in that building had been aware of him, reaching out across time to pull him in. Merritt pulled out his phone and searched for the accident report from 1983. It took some digging, but he finally found a scanned newspaper article from the Harmony Grove Gazette. The headline read, "3 truckers die in mysterious fog accident." Below it were grainy photos of the crash site and headshots of the victims. Merritt's chest tightened as he read their names. Daniel Pritchett, 41. Raymond Kolb, 38. Marcus Voss, 52. 3 men with families, with lives, with futures that ended in a ditch on a foggy night in 1983. The article included quotes from witnesses, other drivers who'd been on the highway that night but had somehow avoided the fog bank. One described it as a wall of gray that appeared out of nowhere. Another said, "I saw their taillights disappear into it, and then nothing. Just silence." The investigation had concluded it was a weather anomaly, possibly caused by temperature inversion or ground-level moisture. But the Weather Service had noted that conditions that night weren't conducive to fog formation. The case was closed, the families compensated, and Harper Station eventually shut down. Just another tragic accident on a dangerous stretch of highway. Except it wasn't just an accident. Merritt could feel that truth settling in his bones. Something had happened at Harper Station that night. Something that trapped those drivers in a moment they could never escape. And now, 42 years later, they were still out there, still lost, still calling for help on a CB radio that shouldn't exist. Merritt started the Kenworth and pulled away from Alma's house, heading back toward the highway. The rain had stopped completely now, leaving the streets wet and shining under the streetlights. Above, the clouds were beginning to break apart, revealing patches of dark sky and a few stars. By the time Merritt reached the highway, the storm had passed. The road ahead was clear and empty, stretching south toward Amarillo. But as he accelerated and the miles began to roll past, Merritt couldn't stop thinking about those 3 drivers. Pritchett, Kolb, Voss, men who'd been doing their jobs, hauling freight across the heartland, when something impossible reached out and pulled them from the world. He thought about their voices on the CB, asking for guidance, begging someone to show them the way out. And he thought about the fog, that unnatural, impossible fog that surrounded their trucks like a prison made of gray air. Merritt drove through the night, his cargo secure, his schedule back on track. But a part of him was still back at Harper Station, standing in that abandoned building, listening to the desperate plea of men who'd been lost for over 4 decades. And he knew, with a certainty that frightened him, that this wasn't over. That sooner or later, he'd have to go back to that place and figure out what really happened there. Not because he wanted to, but because those drivers deserved better than to spend eternity calling for help that would never come. The highway stretched ahead, dark and endless. and somewhere behind him, in the darkness and the rain, Harper Station waited. The CB radio still glowing, the fog still swirling, and 3 trucks still sitting on the shoulder, their drivers trapped in a moment that refused to end. Merritt made his delivery to Amarillo on schedule, unloaded the agricultural equipment without incident, and picked up his next load, a shipment of computer parts heading north to Wichita. It should have been routine, just another job in an endless string of jobs that defined his life on the road. But he couldn't focus. Every time he stopped for fuel or food, he found himself searching for more information about the 1983 accident. He downloaded old newspaper archives to his phone, read accident reports filed with the National Transportation Safety Board, even found a forum thread from 2003 where someone had posted about seeing phantom trucks near Harmony Grove. The details were always consistent. 3 trucks. Dense fog. Voices on CB radios asking for help, claiming to be lost, and always the same location, Harper Station, mile marker 98 on US Route 183. Merritt couldn't let it go. Those 3 drivers, Pritchett, Kolb, Voss, had been doing exactly what he did every day. They'd been hauling freight, following their routes, probably thinking about getting home to their families. And then something had reached out and trapped them in a loop they couldn't escape. It wasn't fair. It wasn't right. And the more Merritt thought about it, the more convinced he became that someone needed to try to help them. Sheriff Knox had said the transmissions happened during storms. Alma Drury had mentioned the voices appeared late at night. If there was a pattern, maybe there was a window, a time when the boundary between their trapped moment and the present was thin enough for real communication. Not just hearing their calls for help, but actually responding in a way they could understand, guiding them out of the fog if such a thing was even possible. Merritt knew it was a long shot. He knew it might be dangerous, but he also knew he wouldn't be able to live with himself if he didn't at least try. 3 days after his encounter at Harper Station, Merritt found himself driving south on Route 183 again. He'd specifically requested a load that would take him back through Oklahoma, and his dispatcher hadn't questioned it. Weather forecasts showed another storm system moving through the area that evening, not as severe as the last one, but enough to bring rain and wind. Merritt timed his arrival for just after sunset, when the light was fading and the storm clouds were building on the western horizon. He'd stopped at a hardware store in Wichita and picked up a powerful handheld spotlight, fresh batteries for his flashlight, and a portable CB base station that ran on its own power supply. If he was going to make contact, he wanted to be prepared. As he approached mile marker 98, Merritt felt his pulse quicken. The highway looked different in the fading daylight, less threatening, but somehow more melancholy. The fields on either side were empty, harvested weeks ago, and the sky had taken on that bruised quality that came before heavy rain. He slowed the Kenworth and pulled onto the shoulder, his headlights illuminating the turnoff to Harper Station. The building sat there in the gloom, unchanged from 3 nights ago. The same sagging awning, the same boarded windows, the same sense of abandonment that clung to the place like a shroud. Merritt parked his truck on the highway shoulder this time, leaving the engine running and the lights on. He wanted a clear escape route if things went wrong. He grabbed his gear, the spotlight, the portable CB, his flashlight, and walked toward the building. The first drops of rain were already starting to fall, cold and heavy, and thunder rumbled in the distance. By the time Merritt reached the entrance, the rain was coming down steadily, soaking through his jacket and plastering his hair to his forehead. He pushed open the door and stepped inside. The building looked exactly as he remembered it. Trash in the corners, graffiti on the walls, the old metal desk in the center of the room. But the CB radio that had been there before was gone. The desk was empty, except for a layer of dust and a few dead insects. Merritt set down his portable CB unit and clicked it on, watching the channel indicator glow to life. He set it to channel 19 and adjusted the squelch, listening to the hiss of static. Outside, the rain intensified, and lightning flickered through the gaps in the boarded windows. Merritt sat on the edge of the desk and waited. He wasn't sure what he was waiting for. A sign, a transmission, the appearance of those phantom trucks. But he felt certain that something would happen. The conditions were right. Storm, darkness, the approaching anniversary of the accident. March 14th was still months away, but Alma had said the transmissions happened throughout the year. Maybe the date didn't matter as much as the place and the weather. Minutes crawled by. The static on the CB remained constant, occasionally broken by distant chatter from truckers on other parts of the highway. Merritt listened to their conversations, weather reports, traffic updates, complaints about load weights, and felt a strange disconnect from their normal world. They were out there living their ordinary lives while he sat in an abandoned building waiting to make contact with dead men. 20 minutes passed, then 30. The storm outside grew more intense, rain hammering on the roof with a sound like gravel being poured. Merritt's clothes were still damp, and the cold was starting to seep into his bones. He was beginning to think this had been a mistake, that maybe Alma was right and there was nothing he could do, when the CB crackled. Not with static this time, but with a voice. Faint at first, barely audible beneath the interference, but growing stronger. Mile marker 92, can't find the road. Fog's too thick. Merritt's hand shot to the microphone. This is Merritt Quayle at Harper Station. Mile 98. I can hear you. What's your location? The response came back distorted, like it was being filtered through water. Mile 92. We've been circling for hours. Can't see anything but gray. 3 trucks, westbound convoy, need guidance. Merritt's heart pounded. This was it. The same transmission from 3 nights ago, but this time he was ready. Convoy, I'm going to try to guide you to my location. You need to head south. Follow mile markers south from 92 to 98. Can you see the markers? A long pause filled with static. Then, markers are there and gone. Everything's shifting. Can't trust what we see. The voice sounded different now. Younger? More frightened. Merritt realized he might be talking to one of the other drivers, not the same one from before. Listen to me carefully, Merritt said, keeping his voice calm and steady. You're caught in something that happened in 1983, a fog storm on March 14th. You and 2 other drivers had an accident. What you're experiencing isn't real anymore. It's a memory, a loop. You need to break out of it. The static surged, and for a moment Merritt thought he'd lost the signal. Then the voice came back, panicked now. What are you talking about? It's March 14th right now. We left Kansas City this morning. We're not in a loop, we're just lost in the damn fog. Another voice cut in, older, gruff. Who is this? If you're trying to help, just tell us which way to go. We don't need a philosophy lesson. Merritt closed his eyes, trying to think. They didn't know they were dead. They didn't know decades had passed. To them, it was still that night, still the same endless drive through fog that wouldn't lift. All right, Merritt said. Forget what I said. Let's focus on getting you to safety. I'm at a rest stop at mile 98. I've got lights on. If you can see any light through the fog, head toward it. Silence. Then the first voice again, uncertain. We don't see any lights, just gray. Wait, there's something. A glow maybe, southeast of our position. The older voice, I see it too. Looks like running lights, maybe a truck or a building. The younger voice, could be a trap. Could be someone trying to lure us off the road. Merritt felt frustration rising but pushed it down. It's not a trap. I'm here to help you. Head toward the light, slowly. Use your low beams and your fog lights if you have them. Take it easy." He stood and grabbed his spotlight, moving to the door. If they were seeing a glow, maybe they were seeing his truck's lights on the highway. He pushed the door open and stepped out into the rain, then clicked on the spotlight and aimed it toward the northern stretch of highway. The powerful beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the rain-slicked pavement and the fields beyond. For several long seconds, nothing happened. Merritt stood there in the downpour, holding the spotlight steady, watching the empty highway. Then, slowly, impossibly, fog began to form. Not everywhere, just in patches, low to the ground, coiling like smoke. It thickened as he watched, spreading across the road in tendrils that defied the rain and wind. Merritt's breath caught in his throat. The fog was appearing out of nowhere, just like the reports had described, and through it, faint and wavering, he saw lights. Headlights, old and yellow, moving slowly toward him through the impossible fog. Merritt keyed the CB again. "I see you. Keep coming. You're almost here." The voice on the radio responded, clearer now. "We see the light. It's brighter now. We're following it." The trucks emerged from the fog like ships appearing through mist. 3 of them, ancient freightliners and a Mack, their paint dulled by decades that hadn't existed for them. They moved slowly, almost dreamlike, their engines making a sound that was both there and not there, a ghost of mechanical noise layered over the rain. Merritt could see figures behind the windshields now, silhouettes of men leaning forward, peering through the fog that surrounded only them. The lead truck pulled onto the shoulder near Harper Station, its air brakes hissing in a way that sounded like a sigh. The other 2 followed, parking in a line just as Merritt had seen them 3 nights ago. The fog swirled around them, thick and gray, and utterly wrong for a rainstorm. Merritt lowered the spotlight but kept it on, providing a beacon in the darkness. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the driver's door of the lead truck opened, and a man stepped down. He was in his early 50s, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt, and he looked around with the confused expression of someone waking from a dream. "Where are we?" the man asked, his voice carrying across the parking lot despite the rain. Merritt recognized it as the older voice from the CB. "Harper Station, mile 98, you made it." The man walked toward Merritt slowly, and the other 2 drivers emerged from their trucks as well. One was in his 40s, stocky with a beard. The other was younger, maybe late 30s, with nervous eyes. They all looked solid, real, not like ghosts or apparitions. But the fog clung to them, moving when they moved like it was part of them. The older driver, Pritchett, Merritt realized, Daniel Pritchett, stopped a few feet away and studied Merritt with a frown. "You the one who guided us in?" Merritt nodded. "Yeah, Merritt Quayle." Pritchett looked around at the building, at Merritt's Kenworth parked on the highway with its lights blazing, at the rain that should have been washing away the fog but wasn't. "This doesn't look right. Where's the staff? Where are the other trucks?" The younger driver spoke up, his voice shaking. "Something's wrong. This place feels wrong." Merritt took a breath, choosing his words carefully. "You're at Harper Station, but not the way you remember it. The station closed down a long time ago. What you're experiencing, the fog, being lost, it's not real. Not anymore." The bearded driver, Kolb, Raymond Kolb, shook his head. "What are you talking about? We've been driving through this fog for hours. It's real. We're real." He held up his hands, as if to prove his solidity. "I can feel the rain. I can feel the cold. How is this not real?" "Because it's March 14th, 1983 for you," Merritt said gently. "But it's October 2025 for me. You had an accident that night. All 3 of you. The fog caused you to go off the road. You didn't survive." The words hung in the air, and Merritt watched their faces change. Confusion giving way to denial, then to something that looked like dawning horror. Pritchett shook his head. "No, that's not. We just left Kansas City this morning. My wife's expecting me home in 3 days. I talked to her on the phone at the last truck stop." "You've been reliving that night over and over," Merritt pressed on, hating every word but knowing he had to say them. "You're caught in a loop, trapped in the moment of your accident. That's why you can't find the road. That's why the fog never lifts. You're not lost in space, you're lost in time." Marcus Voss, the younger driver, backed away, his face pale. "This is insane. You're insane." But his eyes were fixed on Merritt's truck, on the modern design, the LED lights, the digital displays visible through the windows, things that wouldn't have existed in 1983. Pritchett's denial was wavering. Merritt could see it. "If what you're saying is true, then why are we here now? Why can you see us?" Merritt shook his head. "I don't know. Maybe the conditions are right. Maybe the anniversary is coming up, and the barrier between your time and mine is thinner. Or maybe it's because I came here specifically to try to reach you, to help you." Kolb laughed, a bitter sound. "Help us? How can you help dead men?" Merritt didn't have an answer for that. He'd come here with the vague idea that making contact would be enough, that somehow showing them the truth would set them free. But looking at these 3 men, solid and real and trapped in a nightmare they couldn't escape, he realized how naive that was. "I don't know if I can help," Merritt admitted, "but I wanted you to know that people remember what happened to you, that you're not forgotten." Pritchett's expression softened slightly. "My family, are they—" He couldn't finish the question. Merritt pulled out his phone and did a quick search. The obituary came up quickly. "Your wife Margaret passed away in 2014, but you have 3 children, Sarah, David, and Thomas. They're all still alive, grown now with families of their own." Tears welled in Pritchett's eyes. "They grew up without me." It wasn't a question. Merritt nodded, feeling the weight of it. He looked up the other 2 drivers and found similar information. Kolb's wife had remarried. Voss's young son had graduated college and become a teacher. Lives that had moved on, families that had mourned and eventually healed. The 3 drivers stood in silence, processing information that should have been impossible to hear. The fog around them seemed to pulse, thickening and thinning in rhythm with some unseen heartbeat. "What do we do now?" Voss asked quietly. "We can't go back. If we're already dead, if this is all just some kind of echo, then what's the point?" Merritt wished he had answers. Maybe knowing the truth is enough. Maybe accepting what happened will let you move on. Pritchett looked at him sharply. "Move on to what? Heaven? Hell? Or do we just stop existing?" Merritt couldn't answer that. He wasn't a priest or a philosopher. He was just a truck driver who'd stumbled into something far beyond his understanding. The CB radio in the building crackled to life again, and Sheriff Knox's voice came through. "This is Harmony Grove Sheriff's Department to any units in the vicinity of Harper Station. We've received reports of lights and vehicles at that location, requesting any available units respond." Merritt hurried back inside and grabbed the mic. "Sheriff Knox, this is Merritt Quayle. I'm at Harper Station. I'm fine, but—" he hesitated, unsure how to explain what was happening. "You might want to come out here." Knox's response was immediate. "Stay where you are. I'm 10 minutes out." Merritt went back outside, but the scene had changed. The fog was thinning, pulling back like a tide receding. The 3 trucks were still there, but they looked different now. More transparent, less solid. The drivers were fading too, their edges blurring into the rain. Pritchett looked down at his hands and watched as they became translucent. We're going back, aren't we? Back into the loop. I don't know, Merritt said helplessly. Maybe, or maybe knowing the truth changed something. Kolb stepped forward, his voice urgent. If we go back, will we remember this conversation? Will we know what happened to us? Merritt shook his head. I don't think so. I think you'll forget. And you'll be lost in the fog again, calling for help. The thought was unbearable. He'd reached them, connected with them, shown them the truth, and now they were going to slip back into their endless loop, doomed to repeat the same terrified hours forever. Voss spoke up, his voice surprisingly calm. Then maybe that's how it has to be. Maybe we're not meant to escape. He looked at Pritchett and Kolb. We had good lives, didn't we? Before the accident, families, careers, miles behind us. Not everyone gets that. Maybe this... He gestured at the fog, the fading trucks. The impossible situation is just the price we pay for dying the way we did. Sudden, unexpected, no time to say goodbye. Pritchett nodded slowly. Maybe you're right. He turned to Merritt. Thank you for trying, for caring enough to come back here and risk. Whatever this is, not many people would do that. Kolb added, tell our families we loved them, if you can, if it matters after all this time. Merritt's throat was tight. I will. I promise. The fog closed in completely then, swallowing the 3 drivers and their trucks in a wall of gray. Merritt heard their engines one last time, that ghostly, layered sound, and then silence. The fog dissipated as quickly as it had formed, dissolving into the rain as if it had never existed. The parking lot was empty, except for Merritt and his spotlight in the rain hammering down. Sheriff Knox's patrol car pulled up 5 minutes later, lights flashing. The sheriff got out and walked over to where Merritt stood, soaked and shaking. You all right? Knox asked, his voice gruff with concern. Merritt nodded, though he wasn't sure it was true. I saw them, the 3 drivers. We talked. Knox didn't look surprised. What did they say? Merritt told him everything. The conversation, the recognition that they were dead, the fading back into the fog. Knox listened without interrupting, his weathered face impossible to read in the darkness and rain. When Merritt finished, Knox was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, You did more than anyone else has ever done. You gave them a moment of clarity, even if it didn't last. That matters. Merritt wasn't sure he agreed, but he appreciated the sentiment. Knox gestured toward the building. Come on, let's get you somewhere dry. You can give me a full statement, and then you should get back on the road. This place... He glanced at Harper Station, at the dark windows and sagging awning. Isn't meant for the living. They drove to the sheriff's office in Harmony Grove, where Merritt gave his statement while drinking terrible coffee from a machine that looked older than he was. Knox filed it away in a drawer that Merritt suspected was full of similar reports, accounts from other people who'd stopped at Harper Station and seen things they couldn't explain. Before Merritt left, Knox gave him his personal cell number. If you ever need to talk about this, call me. Not many people understand what it's like to witness something that shouldn't exist. I do. Merritt drove away from Harmony Grove as dawn was breaking, the storm finally clearing to reveal a pale sky streaked with pink and orange. He was exhausted, emotionally drained, and no closer to understanding what had really happened at Harper Station. He'd made contact with 3 dead men trapped in a temporal loop. He'd learned their names, their stories, their families. He'd promised to remember them, But had he actually helped them? Or had he just reminded them of what they'd lost, only to send them back into an eternity of confusion and fear? The question haunted him as he drove north toward Wichita. He thought about Pritchett's tears when he heard about his children growing up without him, about Kolb's bitter laugh at the idea of helping dead men, about Voss's quiet acceptance that maybe some loops couldn't be broken. They were still out there, somewhere in the fog that existed between moments, still calling for help on CB radios that flickered in and out of time, still hoping that someone would guide them home. And now Merritt knew that even when someone answered, even when someone tried, it might not be enough. He pulled into a rest area just before Wichita and climbed into his sleeper for a few hours of desperately needed rest. But before he closed his eyes, he made good on his promise. He searched for the families of Pritchett, Kolb, and Voss. He found contact information for Pritchett's daughter, Sarah, and sent her a carefully worded email explaining that he was a truck driver who'd learned about her father's accident and wanted her to know that people still remembered him. He did the same for Kolb's ex-wife and Voss's son. He didn't mention the supernatural encounter. That would have sounded insane, but he made sure they knew their loved ones hadn't been forgotten. Whether the messages would matter, whether they'd bring comfort or just reopen old wounds, Merritt didn't know. But he'd made a promise to 3 men who'd died 42 years ago, and he intended to keep it. As he finally drifted off to sleep, Merritt's last thought was of Harper Station, sitting empty in the morning light, waiting for the next storm, waiting for the next lost soul to hear voices on the CB, waiting for the fog to roll in again and bring with it 3 trucks that couldn't find their way home. And somewhere in that fog, Daniel Pritchett, Raymond Kolb, and Marcus Voss were already forgetting, already slipping back into the loop, already calling for help that would come too late, again and again, forever. 6 weeks passed before Merritt drove Route 183 again. He'd avoided it deliberately, taking longer routes through Kansas and Nebraska even when they added hours to his schedule. His dispatcher had noticed and asked if there was a problem with that highway, maybe construction delays or way station issues. Merritt had made up an excuse about road conditions, and the dispatcher had let it drop. But eventually, the routes aligned in a way that made avoiding 183 impractical, and Merritt found himself heading south through Oklahoma on a cold November afternoon. The responses to his emails had been mixed. Sarah Pritchett, Daniel's daughter, had written back with gratitude, saying it meant a lot to know that strangers still remembered her father decades after his death. She'd included a photo of the Pritchett family from 1982, Daniel standing beside his rig with his wife and 3 children, everyone smiling. Merritt had saved the photo on his phone, though looking at it always made his chest ache. Raymond Kolb's ex-wife had sent a brief, polite reply thanking him for reaching out. Marcus Voss's son hadn't responded at all, and Merritt didn't blame him. Sometimes the past was better left alone, but the encounters at Harper Station had changed something in Merritt. He found himself thinking differently about the road, about the endless miles of highway that connected cities and states and lives. How many other places were there like Harper Station? How many accidents and tragedies had left their marks on the landscape in ways that couldn't be explained by normal physics or logic? He'd started noticing things he'd never paid attention to before. Abandoned rest stops, old way stations, stretches of highway where the CB would go strange for no apparent reason. The road, he realized, had its own memory, and sometimes that memory refused to fade. As Merritt approached mile marker 98, he felt his pulse quicken despite his best efforts to stay calm. It was mid-afternoon, no rain in the forecast, clear skies and moderate temperatures. Nothing like the storm conditions that seemed to trigger the phenomenon. He told himself he was just passing through, that there was no reason to stop, no reason to even look at Harper Station as he drove by. But his eyes were drawn to the turnoff anyway, and before he quite realized what he was doing, Merritt had slowed the Kenworth and pulled onto the shoulder. The building looked the same in daylight, maybe worse, actually, with the sun illuminating every crack in the concrete, every rust stain, every board nailed over the windows. It was just an abandoned structure, unremarkable and slowly collapsing under its own weight. There were no trucks parked nearby, no fog, no mysterious lights, just a relic from a different era of highway travel, forgotten and left to decay. Merritt sat with the engine idling, staring at the place where he'd spoken to 3 dead men. Had it really happened? In the cold light of day, with no storm to blur the edges of reality, the whole experience felt like a dream. Maybe that's all it had been. Exhaustion-induced hallucinations, his mind filling in details from the stories he'd heard. People saw what they wanted to see, believed what they wanted to believe. But Merritt knew better. He'd touched that CB radio, felt the icy cold of the microphone. He'd seen Daniel Pritchett's face, watched tears well in the man's eyes when he learned about his children. He'd heard Marcus Voss's voice, calm and resigned, accepting a fate he couldn't escape. Those weren't hallucinations. They'd been real, even if real meant something different at Harper Station than it did anywhere else. Merritt pulled out his phone and opened the photo Sarah Pritchett had sent. He studied Daniel's face, the confident smile of a man who had no idea his life was about to be cut short. Then he looked at the building, imagining that same man standing in the parking lot, transparent and fading, asking if his family remembered him. Merritt's CB radio crackled suddenly, making him jump. He'd left it on channel 19, and now a voice was coming through, normal, contemporary, with none of the distorted quality of the transmissions from 1983. "A southbound Kenworth at mile 98, you all right? Saw you pulled over." Merritt grabbed the mic, grateful for the contact with the present. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just taking a break." The other driver responded cheerfully. "Roger that. Be safe out there." The transmission ended, and Merritt was alone again with his thoughts. He was about to pull back onto the highway when he noticed something that made him pause. There was a vehicle in the Harper Station parking lot, a dusty sedan that definitely hadn't been there when he'd pulled over. Merritt frowned, studying it through his windshield. The car looked recent, maybe 5 or 6 years old, and someone was standing beside it. A woman, maybe in her 60s, looking at the abandoned building with an expression Merritt recognized. Grief mixed with confusion. She was holding something in her hands, papers, it looked like, and she kept glancing down at them, then back at the building, as if trying to reconcile 2 different realities. Against his better judgment, Merritt shut off his engine and climbed down from the cab. He walked toward the woman slowly, not wanting to startle her. As he got closer, he could see the papers she was holding were old newspaper clippings, yellowed with age. "Excuse me," Merritt called out. "Are you okay?" The woman turned, and he saw that her eyes were red, like she'd been crying. "I'm fine, just visiting." She gestured vaguely at the building. "My husband died here, long time ago." Merritt's stomach tightened. "March 14th, 1983? The woman's eyes widened. "How did you know that?" Merritt moved closer, choosing his words carefully. "I've heard about the accident. 3 trucks, mysterious fog. I'm a driver myself. It's one of those stories that gets passed around." That was true, if incomplete. The woman nodded slowly. "Raymond Kolb. That was my husband. Well, ex-husband by the time he died, but we'd only been divorced for a year. I never stopped. I never really moved on, you know." She looked back at the building. "I come here sometimes, not often, just when I need to feel close to him. Merritt felt like he'd been punched in the chest. This was Raymond Kolb's wife, ex-wife, the woman he'd emailed 6 weeks ago. Mrs. Kolb? She looked surprised. How did you... Then recognition dawned. You're the truck driver, the one who sent me that message about Raymond. Merritt nodded. Merritt Quayle. I didn't expect to run into you here. Mrs. Kolb, she'd said her name was Irene in the email, studied him with sharp, assessing eyes. You said in your message that people remember Raymond, but there was something else, wasn't there? Something you didn't say. Merritt hesitated. He deliberately kept the supernatural elements out of his emails, not wanting to sound insane or cause additional pain. But standing here with Irene Kolb looking at him with those knowing eyes, he felt compelled to tell the truth. I saw him, Merritt said quietly. 6 weeks ago, during a storm. I was at Harper Station, and I made contact with him and the other 2 drivers. We talked. Irene didn't look shocked or skeptical. She just nodded, like he'd confirmed something she'd already suspected. What did he say? He was confused at first, didn't understand what was happening. But when I told him the truth, that it was 2025, that he'd been gone for decades, he accepted it. He asked me to tell his family that he loved them. Merritt paused. He seemed at peace with it in the end, as much as anyone could be in that situation. Irene's eyes filled with tears. Was he in pain? Merritt shook his head. No, not physical pain, but he was lost. They all were, trapped in that night, reliving it over and over. Irene wiped her eyes and looked at the building again. I've felt him here. I know that sounds crazy, but I have. Sometimes when I come here at night, I hear things on the CB radio in my car, voices asking for help. I always thought it was my imagination, my grief, making me hear what I wanted to hear. But maybe it was really him. She turned back to Merritt. Can you help them? Can you free them? Merritt felt the weight of that question settle on his shoulders. I tried. I guided them to this location, made them understand what happened. But they just faded back into the fog. They forgot everything. I don't think they can be freed. I think they're part of this place now, locked into that moment. Irene was quiet for a long time, staring at the building. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft. Then at least they're not alone. At least they have each other. It was a bleak comfort, but Merritt supposed it was something. 3 men trapped in an eternal loop, calling for help that would never come, dying over and over in fog that never lifted. But they were dying together, experiencing the same confusion and fear. Not alone, never alone. I should go, Irene said, tucking the newspaper clippings back into her purse. Thank you for telling me, for being honest. Mrs. Kolb, Irene, one more thing. Merritt pulled out his phone and opened the voice recorder app. If you want, you could leave a message. I don't know if they can hear it, if it would reach them somehow. But maybe during the next storm if the conditions are right. He trailed off, not sure how to finish. Irene understood. She took the phone and held it close to her mouth, her hands trembling slightly. Raymond, it's Irene. I don't know if you can hear this, but I want you to know that I forgive you. For everything. And I never stopped loving you. I hope wherever you are, whatever you're experiencing, you feel that love. You're not forgotten. You never will be. She handed the phone back to Merritt, and he saved the recording. He had no idea if it would do any good, but it felt important to have tried. They walked back to their vehicles together, 2 strangers connected by grief and impossible circumstances. Before Irene got into her car, she touched Merritt's arm. "Be careful on this highway. There are more places like Harper Station than people realize. Places where the past won't let go." Merritt nodded, thinking about all the abandoned rest stops and forgotten way stations scattered across thousands of miles of American highway. How many of them held similar stories? How many accidents and tragedies had left marks that couldn't be seen but could be felt? He watched Irene drive away, then climbed back into his Kenworth. But before he pulled onto the highway, he made a decision. He opened the CB radio panel and set it to record on a loop. If Harper Station was going to continue reaching out, if those 3 drivers were going to keep calling for help, then maybe someone should document it. Not to prove anything. Merritt didn't need proof anymore, but to preserve their voices. To make sure that even if they couldn't escape their loop, even if they were doomed to repeat that night forever, someone would remember. Someone would listen. Over the following months, Merritt made a point of driving through Harper Station whenever his routes allowed. He timed some of his trips to coincide with storms, but he also stopped during clear weather at different times of day and night. The CB recordings captured hours of static, occasional normal trucker chatter, and, 3 times, fragments of those distorted voices asking for guidance through fog. The transmissions were never as clear as that night when he'd made full contact, but they were there. Proof, if he needed it, that something lingered at mile marker 98. Merritt shared the recordings with Sheriff Knox, who added them to his growing file of Harper Station reports. Knox mentioned that the incidents were becoming more frequent, more people stopping there, more sightings of lights and fog. "It's like whatever happened in 1983 is getting stronger," Knox said during one of their phone calls. "Or maybe more desperate. I don't know which is worse." Merritt didn't have an answer. He'd stopped trying to understand the mechanics of what was happening at Harper Station. You couldn't apply logic to something that existed outside normal time and space. What troubled him more was the possibility that Harper Station wasn't unique. He'd started researching other trucking accidents, looking for patterns. Crashes that happened in fog or unusual weather. Drivers who'd disappeared without explanation. Stretches of highway where CB radios consistently malfunctioned. The list was longer than he'd expected. There was a rest area outside Flagstaff where drivers reported seeing a phantom semi from the 1970s. A way station in Montana where people heard voices speaking in languages that hadn't been used in decades. A truck stop in Pennsylvania where the fuel pumps sometimes ran backward, as if time itself was flowing in the wrong direction. The road remembered. That was the conclusion Merritt couldn't escape. Highways were more than just pavement and paint. They were repositories of human experience, witnesses to countless journeys and tragedies. And sometimes, in certain places where the veil between past and present grew thin, that memory became active, became tangible, became dangerous. Merritt started keeping a journal, documenting not just his experiences at Harper Station, but every strange occurrence he encountered on the road. The truck stop where his watch had stopped for exactly 3 minutes before starting again. The rest area where he'd seen his own Kenworth parked in a space he knew was empty. The stretch of highway in Iowa where his CB had picked up a transmission from a driver who'd died in '91. He wasn't sure what he planned to do with this information. Publish it? Share it with other drivers? Turn it over to researchers who studied paranormal phenomena? For now, he just recorded everything, creating a chronicle of the road's memory. Winter came, and with it, more storms. Merritt found himself driving through Harper Station on a night in early December, rain hammering down just like it had during his first encounter. He pulled into the parking lot, an action that had become almost ritualistic, and set up his portable CB. The voices came through within minutes, clearer than they'd been in weeks. "Westbound convoy, mile 92. Fog's so thick we can't see the road. Is anyone out there? Merritt keyed the mic. His response automatic now. This is Merritt Quayle at Harper Station, mile 98. I hear you. Head south toward my position. The familiar exchange, the same words he'd spoken months ago. But this time, something was different. A fourth voice cut in, younger and frightened. Who else is on this channel? I'm not with the convoy, I'm alone, and I think I took a wrong turn. There's fog everywhere, and my GPS stopped working. Merritt's blood ran cold. This wasn't one of the 1983 drivers. This was someone new, someone current, someone who was actually lost right now. Copy that. Where's your location? Merritt asked urgently. I don't know, the voice responded, panic rising. I've been driving for hours and I keep seeing the same mile markers over and over. Mile 92, then 95, then back to 92. It's like I'm going in circles. Merritt grabbed his phone and called Sheriff Knox, putting it on speaker while he continued trying to guide the lost driver. What kind of vehicle are you in? Merritt asked. Ford pickup, gray, heading south on 183. Please, I can't see anything but fog. I don't know what's happening. Knox answered on the second ring. Sheriff, we've got an active situation at Harper Station. Driver lost in fog near mile 92. Sounds like they're caught in the same phenomenon as the 83 accident. Knox's response was immediate and professional. I'm mobilizing units now. Keep them talking. Try to guide them to a safe location. Merritt spent the next 20 minutes on the CB, talking the panicked driver through their terror. The voices of the 1983 convoy faded in and out, sometimes overlapping with the new driver's transmissions, creating a disorienting chorus of past and present. Finally, headlights appeared through the rain, not old and yellow like the Phantom trucks, but modern LED beams. A gray Ford pickup pulled into Harper Station's parking lot and a young man jumped out, soaked and shaking. He was maybe 25, clearly terrified. And he ran toward Merritt's truck like it was the only solid thing in a shifting world. Merritt climbed down and met him halfway. You're safe. You're out of it. The young man was breathing hard, his eyes wild. What was that? What happened to me? I was just driving, and then the fog came out of nowhere, and I couldn't find my way out. Sheriff Knox arrived 10 minutes later with 2 deputies. They took the young man's statement, checked his vehicle for mechanical problems, and found nothing wrong. No drugs or alcohol in his system, no medical conditions that would explain hallucinations. He was just a guy driving home from work who'd gotten caught in something he couldn't understand. Knox pulled Merritt aside while the deputies were finishing up. That's the first time we've had someone escape in real time. Usually, we just find abandoned vehicles or nothing at all. His expression was grim. Whatever's happening at Harper Station, it's escalating. It's not just playing back the 1983 accident anymore. It's actively trapping new people. Merritt felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold rain. So what do we do? Close the highway? Put up warnings? Knox shook his head. On what grounds? That we have a supernatural phenomenon causing temporal distortions? The state would laugh us out of the room. Best we can do is increase patrols during storms and hope we can pull people out before they're lost for good. It was an inadequate response, and they both knew it. But what else could they do? You couldn't fight something that existed outside the normal laws of physics. You couldn't arrest fog that appeared out of season or shut down a highway because ghosts used it. The young man was eventually cleared to leave, though Knox recommended he take a different route home and not drive alone at night for a while. Before he left, he approached Merritt. Thank you for talking me through it. I thought I was going to die out there. Merritt nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Because the truth was, the young man had come very close to dying. or worse, to joining Pritchett, Kolb, and Voss in their eternal loop. One more voice calling for help on a CB radio, one more set of lights appearing during storms, one more tragedy absorbed into Harper Station's hungry memory. As winter deepened and the anniversary of the 1983 accident approached, Merritt found himself thinking more and more about what it all meant. He'd started this journey wanting to help 3 trapped drivers find peace. He'd failed. They were still out there, still lost, still calling for help. And now the phenomenon was spreading, catching new victims, expanding its reach. Maybe Alma Drury had been right. Maybe some roads, once traveled, could never be left behind. Maybe some places were meant to be avoided, their warnings heeded rather than investigated. But Merritt kept driving Route 183, kept stopping at Harper Station, kept recording the voices and documenting the experiences, because someone had to bear witness, someone had to remember. And if he couldn't free the trapped drivers, the least he could do was make sure they weren't forgotten, that their voices continued to be heard even if no one could answer them in a way that mattered. The road remembered. And as long as Merritt kept driving, as long as he kept listening, he would remember too. On the night of March 13th, one day before the anniversary, Merritt parked his Kenworth at Harper Station and waited. The weather forecast called for fog, actual meteorological fog this time, not the supernatural kind, and Merritt wanted to see if that made a difference. He set up his equipment and settled in for a long night. The CB crackled to life just after midnight. Westbound convoy, mile 92. Heavy fog. Can't see the road. Need guidance. Daniel Pritchett's voice, as clear as it had been 6 months ago. Merritt had closed his eyes and keyed the mic. "This is Merritt Quayle. I hear you, Daniel. I remember you. Raymond, Marcus, I remember all of you." He paused, knowing they wouldn't remember him, knowing this was probably pointless. "I can't show you the way out. I wish I could. But I want you to know you're not forgotten. Your families remember you. The road remembers you. And I'll keep listening, as long as you keep calling. You're not alone." Static hissed back at him. Then, barely audible beneath the interference, a response. "Thank you." It might have been his imagination. It might have been atmospheric conditions, or his own desperate need to believe his efforts mattered. But Merritt chose to believe it was real. That somewhere in the fog, in that frozen moment of March 14th, 1983, 3 drivers had heard him. And for a split second, they'd been comforted. The fog never appeared that night. The anniversary passed quietly, marked only by Merritt sitting alone in an abandoned parking lot, listening to voices that might or might not be there. When dawn came, he packed up his equipment and got back on the highway. He had a delivery to make in Amarillo, a schedule to keep, miles to cover. The road stretched ahead, endless and familiar, carrying him forward while behind him, Harper Station sat silent and waiting. Always waiting for the next storm, for the next lost driver, for the next moment when past and present would blur together and 3 trucks from 1983 would appear, surrounded by impossible fog, their drivers calling out one more time for help that would never be enough. Merritt drove on, because that's what truckers did. They drove, and they remembered, and they bore witness to the road's long memory. And sometimes, on certain nights when the weather was wrong and the CB radio crackled with voices that shouldn't exist, they listened, they answered, and they promised that no matter how many times the loop repeated, no matter how hopeless the situation seemed, someone would remember, someone would care. Even if it changed nothing, even if the fog never lifted and the highway never released its grip, someone would keep listening to those voices in the rain. And that, Merritt had come to understand, was all anyone could really do.